Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the 10th Annual Empowering Capable Climate Communicators Symposium. This year, we are proud to host it with the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine, and it is focused entirely on the climate crisis and our health. I would like to take a quick moment to let people know that the University of Miami is doing a study on dry eye and indoor air pollution. We are dropping the link in the chat for those of you that live in Miami-Dade and would like to participate. My name is Natalia Ortiz. I am the Director of Development for the Clio Institute and your host for the symposium. I would like to remind everyone that the symposium is being recorded and you will receive a link at the end of the day. And while we do not anticipate any technical difficulties, if we do experience them, please stand by. We do have a technical team on hand. Now, while a lot of you attending today already know who Clio is, I'm sure there are a lot of you that are learning about us for the first time. Our goal is to educate and empower communities to demand climate action, ensuring a safe, just, and healthy environment for all. The Clio Institute has many educational and advocacy programs, as you will see with our video that I play next. Thank you.
I want you to ask yourselves those tough questions, the ones we avoid: how we want to live, what do we want for our children, what do we want for our planet?
Our atmosphere is so finely tuned for what we need, and we're treating it like a dumping ground, a sewer. The health impact of climate change is a global problem, and we see the results of that on a local level.
If we fail to act now, then we will leave behind a fundamentally degraded planet for our children and grandchildren, a planet that resembles the futures that have been portrayed in dystopian Hollywood films: unprecedented inundation of our coastlines, droughts, floods, heat waves, superstorms. That's the future that we will see if we fail to act on climate.
The Clio Institute was founded in 2010 with the drive to educate and empower South Floridians to act on climate. Founded by Carolyn Lewis, a science teacher by training, her vocation led her to understand what was causing people's apathy towards the glooming climate crisis: knowledge.
We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction.
Today, the Clio Institute is the #1 nonprofit organization for climate education, engagement, and advocacy. Through programs like the Clio Speakers Network, Clio trains people to become climate speakers by breaking down the science, impacts, and solutions. Clio's educational efforts are backed by a world-class expert advisory council of scientists, environmentalists, teachers, and government officials. While the world is already feeling the impacts of our changing climate, not everyone is feeling it the same way. Clio is a leader in the climate justice movement, providing the resources and tools to the most vulnerable communities in South Florida that are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
I wanted to be an outreach for them.
Building communities' resilience through women is the cornerstone of our Empowering Resilient Women program. By teaming up with community members like the YWCA, Clio is able to empower and educate women on how better to prepare for more extreme weather events like hurricanes while building community. Clio works to remove barriers and build a wider coalition to fight climate change across faith-based communities, elected officials, and municipalities, schools, and cultural organizations. One of the most important voices that Clio continues to amplify is that of our youth.
What do we want? When do we want it?
Their Gen Clio program meets regularly with students across the region, training them to be climate ambassadors in their schools and communities.
Dear elected officials,
this is a crisis. Do your job. We'll be watching.
Clio recently launched its Climate Resilient Schools initiative to bring their program into the classrooms while building a robust climate curriculum for Miami-Dade public schools. Clio continues to expand its engagement through multimedia outreach, including television commercials, social media, and billboards. With statewide campaigns like the Florida Climate Pledge,
I care about climate change.
And I care about climate change
because it affects everybody, regardless of race, culture, and ethnicity. because I'm passionate about the success of my future.
I like the Clio Institute because it takes the time to educate people about the importance of climate change and the things that we can do to improve our world.
You can have your voice heard too. Fund our climate action work today. The future of Florida is in your hands.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today. Without you, this event wouldn't be possible. And a special shout out to the British Consulate-General of Miami as our premier sponsor. Now, yesterday, for those of you that joined us, we were fundraising for a very special day called Give Miami Day, and we would like to take a moment to thank everyone that participated. Yesterday was a very special day because we were fundraising for our youth programs. The Clio Institute works with the 4th largest school district in the United States, Miami-Dade County, to bring climate literacy into the classroom. And so we thank you to everybody that participated. Now, today we're fundraising for a different program. It's all about the power of communication through our Clio Speakers Network. And you can actually see two pictures of our Clio Speakers Network that we did this year when we pivoted to online. We take people, we give them all of our slides, we pair them with a coach, and we get them comfortable speaking about the climate science, impacts, and solutions. And this year alone, we have already built 150 climate ambassadors. This is a picture of one of our climate speakers that took her knowledge back to a classroom in Oakland, and another one that took their presentation into their place of work. So when we think about 150 people, think about the ripple effect, because those people are then turn around and educate hundreds more. So while 7 out of 10 Americans believe that the climate crisis is real, think about this. Only 3 out of 10 Americans are actually speaking about it occasionally. So that's the importance behind this program. We're really investing in people so that they can turn around and communicate the climate science impacts and solutions to their community. We hope you find it in your hearts to invest in this program today. And so for today, we'll be hearing welcoming remarks from our Executive Director, Yokarditi Rocha, as well as our founder and Senior Advisor, Carolyn Lewis. We'll then move on to our keynote with Dr. Hayhoe, followed by our panel on climate and extreme weather events with a special recognition, and then we finish with the power of communication sessions with Dr. Hayhoe and Caroline. Without further ado, I welcome Yokarditi Rocha.
Thank you, Nati. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed yesterday's session and found it as inspiring and informative as I did. You'll receive a recap yesterday with great nuggets of information from yesterday's session. But there were 2 things from yesterday's keynote address from Dr. Katharine that are worth repeating based on today's programs. That the climate crisis is not a partisan issue, but a co-benefit issue. And that we need to make this about humanness and not politics. And I'm sure you're probably thinking that's easier said than done. This is such a controversial and complex topic, right? But the reality is that most Americans want clean air, clean water, and a safe environment and a stable climate. And we have another great day planned for you today that is going to revolve, of course, around the climate crisis and the extreme weather events, but also how we communicate and talk about it. Talking about climate change can be challenging. For most people, climate change is an abstract subject tainted with divisive politics. Most Americans know that the climate around them is changing, but people approach climate from different perspectives and have different levels of concerns. But the truth is, we can all speak effectively about the climate crisis. We have another great day planned for you today that is going to revolve and that is going to really give you the tools and the knowledge and the resources that you need to speak comfortably about the climate crisis. You will hear from one of the greatest climate communicators in the world, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who for years have been able to speak with diverse audiences, connecting to them through their values and their belief. This symposium is in its 10th year, and in essence, the objective is to empower all audiences to learn and communicate effectively. Please do not miss the special session at the end of today's program with our very own powerhouse and climate communicator and Clio Institute's founder, Carolyn Lewis, who will join Dr. Hayhoe in the Power of Communication session to discuss those strategies. And now, it is my great honor to introduce a woman that has been lighting fires and empowering people for more than a decade with her education, wisdom, passion, and great sexy Trinidadian accent, our very own arsonist, Miss Carolyn Lewis. Caroline?
Thank you, Yoka. And thank you everyone who is here listening, watching, and speaking either yesterday, today, or tomorrow. It takes a village. I am one proud founder of the Clio Institute. When I look at how far we've come in our 11th year and the incredible staff we have, my cup runneth over. So my sincere thanks to all of you who recognize the great work at Clio and continue to support what we do. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Hayhoe, but before I do that, I wanted to share with you things I have learned about leadership. Clio, in essence, is trying to build climate leadership in every single human being. The CL of Clio stands for climate leadership. And we do this through engagement and education opportunities. And so over the course of my journey, my years in this, I've learned from several wise people. And three of the big takeaways I want to share with you today. First one is to always remember that crisis is opportunity. And then when we look at the climate crisis and we get down and depressed, we have to remember that the only way to combat crisis is to spring into action, to see it as an opportunity to engage, to find your voice and to share your voice. So please keep in mind that as we face this crisis, a multitude of opportunities open up for each and every one of us to do our part. Do it. The second piece of advice I've learned and I want to share with you today is to keep a split screen perspective. You cannot just micro focus on your work and your goals. You have to keep in mind the big picture. So as you go through your work, remember the big picture as you work on the fine details. Example, while trying to pass a climate emergency declaration at the municipality level, we are at the same time fighting for tremendous momentum for the Paris Accord, so that the global movement has that as well. And as we do our work in addressing the climate crisis, locally, regionally, statewide, nationally, we remember the big issues like equity. And we keep in mind that if we don't make a determined effort to address equity in all the solutions we're coming up with, we're going to leave way too many people behind and create a more unjust world. That is not what we do. So keep a split screen perspective and pull back and zoom in as you need to so that you are most effective in addressing this crisis. And the third one, the final piece of advice I learned and I want to share with you is never underestimate your power to influence change. I was born and raised in Trinidad. I was a street urchin running barefoot in the streets of Port of Spain, having the time of my life. Nobody could tell me that decades later, I would be where I am today, doing what I do and inspiring others. Each of us is an educator. And education, as you know, I like to quote William Butler Yeats, education is not the filling of a pail, it's the lighting of a fire. So please embrace your influence on others and address the circles that you can address to get involved and engaged in combating this crisis. Nobody I know has done a better job of embracing these three things: the split screen perspective, that we must keep in mind, that crisis is opportunity, and that we have the power to influence, than Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. I don't know if you know her, but you should. And if you don't know her, please read her bio. It will make you laugh and cry. This is a woman who has a perpetual smile on her face. She's an astrophysicist, a climate scientist, yet she communicates to the masses with poise and joy and optimism in the way she speaks. She, like me, did her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. So I want to give a special shout out to all the Canadians out there that have groomed dynamos like Dr. Hayhoe and several others from the University of Toronto. She has went on to get her master's and PhD. Her bio is loaded with facts, but I want you to know this. Her current research focuses on establishing a scientific basis for assessing regional to local impacts of climate change on human systems and the natural environment. This powerhouse is a gift to all of us. And then without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hayhoe to make our keynote address this morning. Dr. Hayhoe.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. Now, just checking, can you see my video? Is it working or is it very delayed? I'm thinking it's very delayed.
It is a teeny weeny bit delayed. Oh,
okay.
there. Now we got
we'll go with this instead. All right. It is great to be with you here live, whether delayed or in person. And I am going to be introducing a really important topic that the panel that follows will be digging into in more detail. And that topic is, how does climate change affect us here and now where we live? Now, often when we think about climate change, the first thing we think is that people need to understand the science. And it's true, climate change is the most politicized issue in the whole US. As of a few months ago, when the most recent poll was done by the Pew Foundation, coronavirus was the third most politicized issue, race and social justice was the second, and climate change was still the first, as it has been for years, over a decade. We often think if everybody just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? And when we look at public opinion across the United States, we see that in fact, there are large number of people who wouldn't agree with the statement that global warming is happening mostly caused by human activities. In this figure, every little square is a county. You can go into the Yale program on climate communications public opinion maps, and you can zoom in on Florida by congressional district or by county to get more information. But what I'm showing you is the landscape of the whole US. And so we often say, well, if everybody just got on board with the science, surely we could fix this. Unfortunately, that is not our biggest problem. But fortunately, once we know what our biggest problem is, then we can start to effectively tackle it. And I'm going to use these maps to show you what our bigger problem is. Now, everywhere that's blue means that 50% of people said no to the question at the top, and everywhere that's orange means that 50% of people said yes. So when you ask people, is global warming happening? Most people say, yes, it is happening. And then when you say, do you think it's going to affect plants and animals? People say yes. Will it affect future generations? Oh, everybody says yes. Will it affect people in developing countries? People say yes, largely it will. Will it harm people in the US? Well, now the numbers are going down. We're at 61% instead of 72%, but it's still larger than the numbers of people who agree that humans are causing climate change. And then they ask one more question. What is this question? Do you think it will affect you? No. Most areas of the country do not think it will affect them personally. Even in Florida, there are only 2 counties where more than 50% of people would answer yes to that question. And it's not a very dark orange, it's a light orange. The biggest problem we have is that we don't think climate change matters to us. But it does. It matters fundamentally, not just to you living in Florida, not just to me living in Texas. It matters to our entire civilization. Why? Because our civilization is built on an assumption that climate is stable. Yes, since the dawn of human civilization, there have been regional variations. There have been little ice ages and warm periods, But over the scale of the globe, climate has been remarkably stable. Yes, we get our hot and our cold and our wet and our dry. That's weather. Weather is what happens on a certain place, in a certain place, on a certain day, week, or even year. It's like a tree, one tree. Climate is like a forest of trees. Climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. And while one tree could be shorter or taller, one day could be hotter or colder, over that space of the forest, you can say the average tree height is, for example, 30 feet. The average climate for Florida is, and you can tell what that is because it's been stable. Not only that, but we assume that the highs and lows we've seen in the past and the long-term average are a good predictor of future conditions. What aspects of our lives are based on this assumption? Nearly everything. Our residential and commercial building codes are based on what climate was like in the past. What types of crops we grow, where and when and how. That's based on where we could grow them in the past, right? How much energy demand we plan for, if we need a furnace or an air conditioner, and if so, how big. Where our flood zones are, whether we need snow removal capacity or not, our water plans, even the clothes in your wardrobe are based on climate. If you live in Florida, there's no reason to have a giant parka, is there? Here's the thing, planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rear view mirror. It actually works pretty well if what? If the road is straight and climate is not changing, which it's, there's been a few little bumps and wiggles over the last few thousand years, but there hasn't been anything major. And so that's why we've gotten away with just looking in the rearview mirror. Why does climate change matter? Climate change matters because it is a massive curve in the road. And there is no way that we are going to make it around that curve in the road if we're just looking backwards. All of our planning has to incorporate how climate is changing and how that is affecting our cities, our insurance rates, our water availability, our food, the economy, national security, and our health. So we still have hot and cold, wet and dry, but as climate changes, our long-term trend is trending up. We see global temperature increasing. We see precipitation patterns shifting, and perhaps most relevant to Florida, we see that the oceans are taking up over 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped by the blanket of heat trapping gases that we're wrapping around our planet. So what's happening is we are seeing that the long-term baseline of our climate is changing, and that affects all the conditions that we use to plan for our infrastructure, our resources, our health, and more. The oceans absorbing all this heat are rising. They're rising because warmer water takes up more space. That's half of the reason why they're rising. And the other half of the reason why they're rising, this is just showing different gauges around the country. And you can see that in Florida, it's rising relatively quickly. New Orleans, Louisiana, and Houston are the only ones where relative sea level rise is any higher. The other half of the reason why it's rising is because of land-based ice melt. When the land on the ice melts, that water goes into the ocean. And unfortunately, that's happening faster and faster. Greenland and Antarctica, NASA scientists discovered just this past March. Maybe it didn't make such big headlines because it was right in the middle of the pandemic lockdown, but they discovered that Greenland and Antarctica are melting 6 times faster than in the 1990s, which was just 25 years ago. If this acceleration continues, we could be looking at more extreme sea level rise projections. And here's a map of ultimately what Florida could look like if this type of trend acceleration continues. It would change the face of the landscape. We are already seeing that sea level rise is increasing the risk of coastal flooding. We are already seeing that when you get high tides, we've got sea level rise on top of the high tides. And that is increasing our risks. You probably know, in fact, many of you may have seen how Miami Beach is raising the level of its streets and installing pumps. You might have heard about the Zillow study that showed that your coastal home in Florida could lose 15% of its value by 2030. And in fact, homes at risk from coastal flooding in Florida have already depreciated by 7%. And they've shown that the ability to sell your home is already changing based on whether it's at risk for flooding or not. That has already happened in Florida. Climate Central has a great series of maps showing how much land would flood, but also showing the total value of the homes at risk in the counties. And it's no accident, I think, that Miami-Dade, which has the largest value of homes at risk, is also the county that is most concerned about climate change, as you just saw in those previous maps. But it isn't only about changes in the average, like changes in average sea level. It's also about changes in the extremes. And this is where we see climate change hitting us today, because it takes the risks we already face and it is exacerbating them or making them worse. We know that wherever we live, we are already at risk from floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, hurricanes, wildfire. In Texas, we've actually had more billion-dollar weather and climate disasters than any other state, but Florida is up there too. So we know that these happen naturally, right? Of course they do. So where does climate change come in? Well, it's as if we have a pair of weather dice. And every time we throw those dice, we have a chance of rolling a double six, a severe drought or a flood or a storm. But what climate change is doing decade by decade is sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and then another of those numbers, turning them into sixes too, and then even making one a 7 or 2 a 7. So we start rolling these extreme events much more frequently. And we say, how could you have 3 500-year flood events in 3 years, like the city of Houston did? That just doesn't make sense. Well, if the road is straight and climate isn't changing, it doesn't make sense. But if climate change is weighting the weather dice against us, if we are on a major curve in the road, it makes all the sense in the world that the information from the past is no longer an accurate predictor of what we expect in the future. So what exactly is happening? Well, the National Climate Assessment was released 2 years ago. It's a fantastic resource, and maybe Natalie could drop it into the chat there. We're putting resources in the chat there. The web link is nca2018.globalchange.gov, and it has a chapter for each region of the US and chapters for each sectors like transportation and health and water and indigenous peoples and more. So a few highlights from the National Climate Assessment. We already see that heavy precipitation is becoming more frequent. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, as opposed to 50 or 100 years ago, there's more water vapor for that same storm to sweep up and dump on us today than there used to be. That's why we see increases in heavy precipitation. We aren't seeing a change in the overall number of hurricanes over climate timescales, although this year was certainly an exceptional year. But what we are seeing is that when hurricanes form, they're powered by what? By warm ocean water. And how much of the heat that's being trapped inside the climate system by this blanket we're wrapping around the planet from digging up and burning fossil fuels, how much of that heat is going into the ocean? Over 90%. So it is powering hurricanes that intensify faster. They are bigger than they used to be. They are stronger than they used to be. They're slower than they used to be, which is bad news. It means they sit over you for longer, and they have a lot more rainfall associated with them. Hurricane Harvey happened 2 years ago, and afterwards, scientists crunched the numbers and they were able to determine through an emerging new field called attribution of extreme weather, they were able to determine that about 40% of the rainfall that fell during Hurricane Harvey, and in some places they got 50 inches, would not have happened if the same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago before the world had warmed, because there wouldn't be as much water vapor in the atmosphere. And they also determined, and this study came out in April, so again, probably you didn't hear much about it because the news is just full of coronavirus lockdown, But they discovered that it's estimated that the storm was 4 times more economically damaging because of it being supersized by a changing climate than it would have been otherwise. So without climate change, would we have had Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Ike, all of those hurricanes? Sure, we absolutely would have, but they wouldn't be as bad. That's the difference. We also see that climate change is making extreme heat much more intense and much more likely. And our news has just been absolutely fixated, especially, last month before the presidential election, by the apocalyptic orange skies in Western states. Climate change is not changing the number of wildfires because most of them are just human ignition. But what climate change is altering is the area burned by wildfires, because it is drying out the vegetation. So when that person dumps the load of burning trash into the brush, or when that power line sparks, or when the fireworks at that gender reveal party go off, those are all real examples of what started fires. It's like dropping a match into a pile of bone dry kindling. It just goes off in a conflagration and it burns much greater area than it would have otherwise. As you can see from this remarkable figure that the California Fire Agency released this fall, 1/3 of the area burned by wildfires since records began in 1932 occurred in 2020. Is that not mind-boggling? That's how climate change is loading the dice against us. And it's not just in the lower 48 states. Alaska's worst wildfire season was last year. In Canada, the most costly insured disaster was a wildfire Fort McMurray 4 years ago. And in January, headlines were dominated by what? I know it's hard to think back all the way to last January, but last January were the Australian bushfires. And they too were exacerbated by the impacts of a changing climate. We know, and this is part of the National Climate Assessment, that climate change is increasing the area burned. And now we even know how much. Up until 2015, scientists estimate climate change had pretty much doubled the area burned by wildfire. So we would have seen a certain amount of wildfire burned anyways, but that area doubled. Now, if this was extended the next 20 years, I think we'd see a significant increase. The question again, though, and this relates directly to how do we connect climate change to our lives? The question is not, did climate change cause this event? The question is, did it make it worse? And 9 times out of 10 these days, the answer is yes. If you want to know more about this new field called attribution, I actually have a tremendous recommendation for you. It is a book called Angry Weather. It was just released in September. We'll put a link in the chat in just a second if you're interested. It is by a scientist. Her name is Ferdy Otto, and she studies how much climate change affects our extreme weather, our heat waves, our storms, our floods, and more. This is a great book. Don't be scared by the word science in the title. It's very easy to read. She tells lots of stories about her life and how she started to learn all of this and what she didn't know and what they know now. And it really helps to understand how climate change is not a future issue. It is not about plants and animals. It is not just about developing countries. It is not just about other people living in the US. Climate change is about us here and now. And that's how we can address the biggest problem we have. Because the biggest problem we have is that we think that it doesn't matter. But in reality, it is, as the military calls it, a threat multiplier. We care about a changing climate because it takes the risks we already face today and it makes them worse. We care about climate change not because it's a separate issue on our priority list. In fact, I don't think climate change should even be on our priority list at all. And I'm a climate scientist. I care about it because it affects our health. It affects the future of my child. It affects my life today. It affects the economy right now. It affects the security and safety of our homes and our countries. It affects our food and our water. Almost everything you can think of is affected by a changing climate. But as Caroline pointed out, it is profoundly unjust. As much as it affects each of us listening here today, it affects people who are poor much more. Already, Climate change has increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25% already since the 1960s until now. We know that climate change disproportionately affects women and children, especially in poor countries. It disproportionately affects Indigenous people who have already lost so much. And it disproportionately affects communities that are marginalized and communities of color. Climate change is profoundly unfair. So what are we supposed to do about this problem? Well, the interesting thing is that those Yale maps I showed you, ending with this one, do you think climate change will affect you personally? These maps have the answer. There's one more map I haven't showed you, and it's a darker blue. What do you think it is? It is, do you think, or actually, sorry, not do you think, do you ever talk about it? No, not even in Florida. Only about 35% of people talk about it. So 72% of people think it's real, and only 35% talk about it. That's a huge gap. That's less than half. Less than half of the people who think it's real talk about it, even occasionally, even once in a while. And here's the connection. If you don't talk about it, why would you care? If you don't care, why would you act? So that is why the first step to effective climate action is to talk about it. Not dumping the science on people, by explaining though, how it matters to us now and here and what we can do to fix it. Now, we're going to have a whole hour-long workshop on communication. So I'm not going to get too into detail here on how we have these conversations because we're going to be going there next. But what I do want to do is just give you a little hint, and that is that we often start off by being worried about climate change. And so we think we just have to dump more scary data on people, and that will surely change their minds because that's what convinced us. But if people aren't convinced, often scary data makes people reject something more rather than accepting it. And we see inaction result. And we think, well, why is this happening? Well, neuroscience has an answer. Neuroscientist Tali Sherrod explains that fear and anxiety actually cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than taking action. So instead, we need to break the cycle. When climate changes and we get worried, we need to explain to people why it matters to them and what we can do to fix it. That's how we need to have our conversations. So when climate changes and we get worried, break the cycle. Talk about what's happening in Florida and talk about how people can get involved in positive change. People feel empowered and action results. As Sherrod says, she says, our brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. That is how we empower people for change. So I love telling stories about how in Texas, we have the second town ever to be powered by 100% clean energy in the US. We have the biggest army base in the US that's been powered by wind and solar energy for 2 years. We have a carbon neutral airport, who knew? And in Florida, there's all kinds of good news to share about unexpected spokespeople, about regional action and adaptation plans, about solar energy, and more. We can also talk about what's happening in industry with major corporations. We can talk about what's happening in faith communities, Catholics, evangelicals, and more. We can talk about what's happening around the world in terms of clean energy developments. And if you lack good news solutions, check out Project Drawdown. The link is drawdown.org, and I'll put that in the chat right now. Drawdown.org, it has over 100 amazing, innovative, thoughtful solutions you can learn about and share. I'm not going to give you my TED Talk, not now and not later, but if you want more about how we talk about climate change, stay here for the panel, join us for the workshop afterwards, and give my TED Talk a watch. It's got lots of great examples of how our very first step to engaging each other is to connect through conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe, for that amazing presentation. We are going to open you up to 2 questions from our Gen Clio Clip students. The first one is from Southdale Senior High. What health conditions and ages are most at risk due to climate change? What age groups would be affected the most?
Well, what we know is that burning fossil fuels produces both air pollution and heat trapping gases. Air pollution makes our lungs more vulnerable to COVID. So people who already live in polluted areas, when they're exposed to the virus, they're more likely to get it, and they're more likely to get very sick from it than they would be otherwise. So there is a direct link between fossil fuels, air pollution, and the coronavirus pandemic and our vulnerability to it. And this illustrates a general principle. The more vulnerable we already are, the more vulnerable we are to climate impacts. So especially people who are elderly or very young, people who suffer from pre-existing conditions, people who live in marginalized communities that don't have access to quality health care, people who are already vulnerable due to exposure to toxins or pollutants or others. Those are the people who are most vulnerable. And that again is why climate change is so unfair.
Thank you. And the follow-up question is from Miami Springs Senior High. Is there a possibility for the hurricane categories to increase once the climate crisis develops? This is from the kids.
I love that question. So this might be a question to ask to the panel that follows also, because I know there's some people there who could answer that, like John. But I have certainly seen some discussion about considering a category 6. But here's what I've been thinking. And I don't know that I've heard anybody say this. I've been thinking we're only using wind speed as a category to categorize the hurricanes. But we know that not only are hurricanes getting stronger, they're intensifying faster, they're getting bigger, they're getting slower, and they have a lot more rain associated with them. And with Hurricane Harvey, for example, most of the damage was not due to the wind, most of it was due to the rain. So in a way, our measure of hurricane categories that only depends on wind speed, it actually doesn't convey the full extent of how damaging they could be. And one classic example of that was Superstorm Sandy. It wasn't even a hurricane category storm when it hit, but it produced enormous damages. So although people are talking about a possible category 6, personally, I would support a more hybrid categorization that actually communicated the risk from flooding and wind damage and any other factors, because otherwise people might be kind of lulled into a false sense of security, like, oh, it's just a category 3. And then it turns out it's like one of the biggest flooding events you've ever seen. So I think in some cases it actually might be misleading in a warmer world.
Very interesting. Food for thought for us living here in Florida. Thank you for those 2 questions. Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. We look forward to our second session with you on the power of communication. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Jones-Parr, head of the UK Science and Innovation Southeast US, that will be speaking on behalf of the British Consulate-General. Dr. Parr.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the chance to shout about UK climate goals and how we're putting our money where our mouth is. Because now more than ever, we need solidarity in sustainability. As we, the global community, recover from the coronavirus pandemic, every country faces a choice. We can lay the foundations for sound, sustainable, inclusive growth, grounding our economies in the industries of the future, or we can tie ourselves to stranded assets and familiar ways of the past, locking in polluting emissions for decades to come. We in the UK encourage countries to seize the opportunity to develop green, inclusive, and resilient recovery plans that can deliver both for the economy and for the planet. We need to move to decarbonize the global economy 3 to 5 times faster in the next 10 years than we have been moving over the last 2 decades. This is going to require stronger national action and stronger international collaboration to maximize our efforts and our outcomes. So we want to mobilize not only governments, but also businesses and academia and civil society so that we can accelerate this transition. As you may know, the UK is co-hosting with Italy COP26 in just about a year in Glasgow. Our priorities for and our work streams for this event are focused on developing and implementing nature-based solutions to climate change, a clean energy transition, clean transport, green finance, and adaptation and resilience. The UK is also co-hosting the Climate Action Summit on the 12th of December of this year, which is the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. We're doing this, and 2 days ago, my minister also announced the UK's green industrial revolution. The UK was the birthplace of the first industrial revolution, and we want to also spearhead the green industrial revolution. And so he's put together a 10-point plan underwritten by £12 billion of investment with an aim to eradicate our contribution to climate change completely by 2050. So I'm going to go through the 10 points of this plan quickly. These 10 main points are built around the UK's strengths. The first point is offshore wind. We want to quadruple our output of energy produced by offshore wind by 2030. The second point is the hydrogen economy. We want to build out this proof of concept and create the first town that's entirely heated by clean hydrogen energy by 2030. We're investing in nuclear energy also, both large scale and small scale advanced reactors. Fourth point, electric vehicles. The UK is stopping the sale of all new cars with internal combustion engines by 2030. That's in 9 years. And then by 2035, we won't be selling hybrid cars either. We want to be the first decarbonize road transport. And part of that transport is also public transport, which takes me to point number 5. We want to make walking and cycling more attractive. We're investing in that infrastructure, and we're also investing in zero emission public transport. Beyond road transport, we also feel like transport of by ships and planes is very important. These are hard to decarbonize industries, so we're investing in research to try to help them decarbonize. Point number 7, homes and public buildings. We have a lot of aging infrastructure in the UK, and so we are trying to increase our energy efficiency there, and we're installing, we have a goal to install 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028. Point number 8, carbon capture and storage. We aim to remove 10 megatons of CO2 from the atmosphere by 2030 using carbon capture storage technologies. And we want to be the world's leaders in this technological field. So I think we have committed to £1 billion of investment in this space. Number 9 is nature. We are going to plant 30,000 hectares of trees per year, and we're going to invest in protecting our natural environment, both on the seas and on land. And number 10 is finance. The City of London, our goal is to make the City of London the global center for green finance and underpin that with innovative technologies that ethically leverage our resources. So that's the beginning of our path, the UK's path to net zero emissions. And we want to hold up others that are moving along this path to have similar ambitions. And that's why we are supporting the great work that the Clio Institute is doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. And now, without further ado, I would also now like to move on to our panel, moderated by Mr. John Morales, who is a Clio board member and the chief meteorologist for NBC6, As the panel gets started, please feel free to start inputting your questions into the Q&A function, but they will not be addressed until the end of the panel when Mr. John Morales takes them. So you can start putting them in now, but they'll be addressed towards the end. John?
Thank you, Natalia. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here, especially with such distinguished company. This panel is titled The Health Burden in the Aftermath of Extreme Weather Events. But I'm also going to be wanting to discuss, because everybody thinks of extreme weather events as, floods and hurricanes and droughts. But one of the biggest killer of extreme weather events is heat. And I definitely want to at some point discuss heat, and particularly as we're living through the hottest year on record for not just the city of Miami, where we're originating this panel discussion from, or at least the moderator is located, but the majority of the cities in the Florida Peninsula are experiencing their hottest year on record. And when you think of climate justice, when you think of what our frontline communities have to face in terms of this increased heat, without the ability to properly cool themselves for numerous reasons, you start to be concerned about what is extreme weather or a shift in the climate, but something a lot of people forget about. All right, let me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly, very briefly introduce our panelists. Then each one of them, after all four are introduced, each one of them will have a short presentation. And then after those presentations, we're going to come back and have a panel discussion. So today, joining us as Senior Vice President at the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center is Kathy Bowman-McLeod. We also have Dr. Carissa Caban, Assistant Professor, Director of Behavioral Health Services at Florida International University. We have Dr. Naresh Kumar, Associate Professor of Environmental Health in the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Miami. And we have Dr. Timothy Hall, Senior Research Scientist at NASA. And Tim, we are going to start with you. So take it away.
Thank you, John, for having me, and Natalia for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this really important event and to be part of contributing to this important institute. Also thank you to Katharine Hayhoe for that excellent big picture view of climate change and the sort of the hopeful presentation she gives and the way to phrase the questions. So I'm going to, without further ado, dig into one of the details that Katharine mentioned and is dear to the hearts of everyone in the Florida area, and that's hurricanes. So I'll be talking about the meteorology side, the weather side of extreme events. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I will, let's see, did that work? Share. Why is it telling me to open system preferences? Darn it.
Oh no.
Hold on. Share. And share. That looks more promising. Okay, there we go. Oops. PowerPoint is over here. And we'll go to full screen mode. There we go. So I'm going to talk about hurricanes and how climate change is impacting them, which obviously has big repercussions for Florida. But I would be remiss if I didn't make some comments about this particular season. Climate is, Katharine Hayhoe pointed out, is the view of weather changing over many years, decades. But this particular season was so striking that it's worth pausing and commenting on it. And so here's a great satellite image mid-season of 5 storms spinning at the same time in the season, which is pretty rare. And if you actually, there are many ways you can measure the activity in a particular hurricane season. One that gets maybe the most prominence is the number of storms that form that get intense enough to get a name. That means they are at least tropical storm status, and then they have different levels of intensity when they get to hurricane level. But if you just look at the number of storms that formed in this season as a function of time through the season, so I've got January, February, March, April, all the way through to the end of the year, December, on that, that figure on the right. The blue line is what you expect on average over many years, just looking at average historical data. The light blue area is the maximum we've seen before this year and the minimum. The maximum was the 2005 season, an infamous hurricane season. And then the symbols with the names of what's happened so far this year, starting with Arthur all the way through to Iota. We're well into the Greek letters at this point when we use 22 Roman alphabet names, and then when we run out of those, we move into Greek letters, and maybe it'll be a Kappa. That would be the next one if we got to it. And so that's right now we're sitting at 30 name storms. That breaks the record of 28 in 2005. That's not the only metric, and maybe not the most useful metric for the intensity of a particular season. One of the others has to do more with the total energy that hurricanes have expended over the course of the season. And one measure of that is something that meteorologists call the accumulated cyclone energy, ACE, it's known as. And by this measure, the 2020 season is still way above average, 180 ACE units compared to an average of 106. Although the 2005 season actually had 250 ACE units because it only had 28 storms, but a few of them were really intense, like Wilma and Katrina and Rita. Now, another way you can talk about the intensity of a season is how much damage coastal communities suffered. Now, there are many ways to measure damage. Possibly the easiest one is to look at insured losses. That's a very imperfect measure of the human suffering and the physical damage, but it's one that we can quantify easily. And so to date in the 2020 season, there have been just shy of $40 billion in insured losses. You compare that to 2005 of $238 billion, 2017 of $306 billion. So although there are a lot of storms this season, in some sense, we've been lucky because the storms that have formed, if they had just made slightly different landfalls, they would have hit much more populated centers, and there would have been even more human suffering and more damage. So it's weird to call ourselves lucky when we've had a record-breaking season, but in some ways we are. So we'll go on here. But like I said, and like Katharine pointed out, a particular season is an example of weather variability mostly. We want to look at the long-term trends and how they're related to climates and hurricanes. And I like to, there are many factors involved there, and I like to state them. One way to state them is in the order of certainty, what we know most and what we don't know as well. The first thing we know best of all in terms of hurricanes and climate really is not a climate issue at all. It's simply that there's more population and infrastructure in harm's way. So even if the climate weren't changing and hurricanes weren't changing with it, we've just put more stuff in Hurricane Alley, for example, Southern Florida and other places. The second thing, and Katharine talked about this also, is that one of the most robust projections of a changing climate is that sea level increases. And a big chunk of that, roughly half of that, is simply because the oceans are warming and warm water takes up more volume. So that means the oceans are rising. And then we're getting increasingly larger components of that sea level rise from the melting of land-based ice sheets like Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets. That's a very robust projection. So even if hurricanes weren't changing, in the presence of higher sea level, those same winds blowing over a higher baseline are going to drive the surge flooding deeper inland. And so the flooding due to surge is the wall of water that the hurricane winds blow onto the coast. The flooding due to surge is one of the primary hazards of hurricanes. You can think of three hazards really: the winds, blowing down structures in the way, the surge, that wall of water being driven inland from the winds, and also the flooding due to rain. And that's Hurricane Harvey is a textbook example of that. And I'll talk about that briefly next. The third thing, that there's really a pretty strong consensus now in the community of scientists who study hurricanes and climate, that the intensity of storms is increasing already, and it will continue to increase in the future. Not necessarily the frequency of storms, but the ones that do form are going to reach stronger wind speeds. And that's mostly because the fuel for storms is the warm seawater below them. Now we get on to another robust projection is that hurricanes will rain more. I'm sorry, I skipped over that one. And that's because warmer air holds more water in vapor form. That's basic thermodynamics. And when the meteorological conditions are right, as they are in a mature hurricane, that water vapor can be converted into rain. So the same, even if hurricane statistics didn't change, you get more rain from them. And that's something not just true for hurricanes, but summer thunderstorms and other types of storms. Now we get into some really issues that have large repercussions for the hazard of particular coastal locations. But there's some evidence, some very strong and interesting evidence that they're changing with climate, but the details are still at the cutting edge of what we're figuring out. And one of them is the changing patterns of storm propagation, where the storm goes. I mean, if you're in Miami, whether sort of on average storms are getting stronger or on average they're raining more, it doesn't really make any difference if the storm doesn't hit you. So in some sense, in terms of regional hazard, really the most important factor about a hurricane is where it goes. And if there are even slight statistically average changes in where hurricanes go, it will have massive repercussions for local communities. Some will be worse, some actually might be better. Even though storms get stronger, if somehow those patterns of storm propagation shift away from that region, they won't be hit as often. Now there is evidence that I'm going to talk about one factor of changing storm propagation, and that is that they're slowing down. And they're mostly slowing down, not because on average they move slower. I don't mean slowing down in intensity. The intensity is a circular motion, but the translation speed, how long it's going to take to get from some point in the mid-Atlantic to Miami, that's the translation speed. And that seems to be slowing down. And that's related to a pretty robust signal in a changing climate. And that is that the large-scale wind patterns in the atmosphere are slowing down as climate warms. That's seen in most climate simulations. The reasons why are pretty subtle, but it's a pretty robust signal. And hurricanes are largely steered by those large-scale wind patterns. It's like a spinning cork in a stream. The current of the stream moves it along. And there's good reason to suspect that the currents are slowing down, the cork is moving a bit more slowly. And in fact, it's more like the current is not so much slowing down, but it's having more and more eddies in it, like points where the hurricane just doesn't know what to do, it just stalls out. Hurricane Dorian over the Bahamas last year is a classic example of that. It sat as a Category 5 hurricane for 48 straight hours over the northern Bahamas and just wreaked absolute devastation on those islands. Another classic example was Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And now what I'm showing here in this top left panel is a measure of how frequently year by year hurricanes stall. They we defined a measure. They sit in a confined region for a certain amount of time without exiting that region, just bobbing around, doing their damage. That's called a stall. And stalls are becoming more frequent. There's a lot of noise in this system, it's true. But if you look on average over the last 40, 50 years, there's a definite increase in the frequency, the odds that a storm will stall. Now, it's not too surprising that if a storm is stalled over you and raining, the longer it sits over you, the more rain is going to accumulate. But just to back up that claim, the second figure shows you the number of hours, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80 hours a storm could be sitting over you and then how much rain falls for a storm that sits over you that long. And I really like the units of rain. Those are the units on the y-axis from 0 to 12, and they are cubic kilometers of water. That really gives you a sense of the volume of water we're talking about raining on a region. Hurricane Harvey was a sort of a textbook example of this, archetypical example. This figure I have on the right, I think great credit to the Washington Post and Capital Weather Gang for coming up with this, because this is the kind of figure that really communicates the order of magnitude of effect we're talking about. You know, it's one thing to talk about 50 inches of rain or 30 inches of rain, that's a lot. But here we're talking about the volume of water that Hurricane Harvey dropped on Houston. Basically, Hurricane Harvey just stalled right off the Texas coast and turned itself into a conveyor belt, carrying warm Gulf water up into the atmosphere, converting it to rain and dropping it on Houston. And so it was roughly, and this was actually during the middle of it, it's actually bigger than this. It was roughly a cube of water 3 miles on the side that got dropped on Houston. So you won't be surprised to hear that did a lot of damage on Houston. So I will stop it there. There are a ton of interesting topics to talk about here, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of one of them and, you know, and leave time to entertain questions.
And we will get to those indeed a bit later, Tim. For now, I want to move on to our next panelist, Kathy Bowman-McLeod from the Arsht Rockefeller Center.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm Kathy Bowman-McLeod, and I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. It's a quiz afterward on repeating that 5 times. I am thrilled to be here with our partners at Clio. I'm a longtime Floridian. I was reminiscing to Hurricane Andrew when I was living on Miami Beach and headed to see family in Key West and drove down US 1 through Homestead and Florida City and saw things I'd never seen before. And the world changed after Andrew, and Florida changed after Andrew. And Florida is such a center of thinking about climate change. And I later worked for the chief financial officer of the state of Florida and got a full perspective on what risk looks like for a big climate exposed state. And so I'm thrilled to be here today with you all. And I want to focus a little bit on extreme heat. And Dr. Hayhoe talked about heat, and I think we've left global warming long behind. I think we are fully ensconced in global heating. And as we heard from John, that this is the hottest year ever. It's the hottest decade ever. States are shattering heat records. Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah. It was 130 degrees in Death Valley in California, hottest ever recorded temperature on Earth. So I want to get down into heat, and I want to get down into how unfair it is. So that's such a great, easy way to think about it from Katharine Hayhoe. Climate change is absolutely unfair. But just a quick minute on the Resilience Center. Adrienne Arsht is a known figure and leader of the Miami community, and she is the founder of the Resilience Center and has had a passion and vision for resilience. And this center is a reflection of that. We are also partnered with and enjoy the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, and are partners with the city of Miami, with Miami-Dade County, and with the city of Miami Beach, our partners at Resilient 305. And so we have kicked off our center about a year and a half ago to embark on a journey to reach 1 billion people with resilient solutions to climate change, migration, and human security. And human security, in that we mean your individual resilience, your health, public health, food, water security. And so have partnered around many activities, including the Miami Resilience Hub in Greater Miami with the community and with Clio and other partners. So you may know that heat is killing more people in the United States than any other natural disaster, than hurricanes and floods combined. I've talked about breaking those records, and it's not just that heat is a shock as a heat wave, it's also a stress. So you have these big dramatic storms, and the The good thing about hurricanes, there aren't many, but the good thing about hurricanes is they are dramatic and they command your attention. And they have a name and they have a brand and a hashtag. And we think from the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about, we think that heat waves should also have names. We think that the risk is growing and the impacts are growing, and our understanding of heat and how it impacts not just the human body and our health, but also our communities, our infrastructure, lost wages, airplanes can't fly. The recognition of those impacts is growing. The quantification needs work. And so we, with a diverse group of folks, 30 plus people, individuals and organizations that range from the city of Miami, Miami Beach and Miami-Dade County to Melbourne, Australia, Mexico City, Athens, Greece, and Tel Aviv, and I'm missing one, Chennai in India, along with partners in the insurance industry, the Red Cross Global Disaster Preparedness Center, public health experts, and climatologists. We've come together under the banner of the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance with a vision of a world with no death and no loss of livelihood from heat. And so we are getting underway and focused on some specific gaps in the work that I want to talk about later when we get into the Q&A. But I also want to talk about some specific things that people are doing. You know, Dr. Hayhoe said, what can we do? And there are so many evidence-based interventions that can, yes, address the impacts of climate change. And I am a firm believer in, while we address the mitigation of climate change, that we address the adaptation at the same time. And it's not, despite the map that Dr. Hayhoe showed us, these things are happening right now. They are costing us money right now. I mean, just in heat alone, thinking of people trying to get COVID tests where the testing has to be shut down because the pavement's too hot for the healthcare workers to stand in the parking lot to administer the test because they're passing out. I mean, that's one really obvious direct way that heat is impacting our attempts to solve for our coronavirus, but also in all of the delivery folks that are bringing us our Amazon packages while we are having everything delivered in a quarantine. And there are no protections for a lot of workers. There are some great laws in California, but my bigger point is there are lots of things we can do to address extreme heat and climate impacts. And I want to talk about what those things are. And I want to close with an example from the city of Miami Beach, who has released a fantastic heat plan for the city. And one of them that I think tells you how epic this risk is that the iconic coconut palms that are the image that the world thinks of when you think about Miami Beach are being taken down, and they're being replaced with shade trees to try to reduce the temperature so that people can be outside and walking around doing the things that we do in our daily life. And so to take down those coconut palm trees tells you this is what the future is. We've got to adapt, and there are lots of things we can do. Nature is a huge solution for these risks, but I look forward to sharing more about the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance and about our center, and we're thrilled to be here today. And thank you so much, John.
Thank you. So, I mean, heat is more intense, more pervasive, and it's the #1 killer, right? So keep that in mind. Hurricanes, of course, are a greater proportion of them are becoming stronger across the planet. More of them are reaching category 3, 4, and 5. Recently, there's been a lot of those. One of them, of course, infamous Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So now, to move on to our next panelist, I'm going to introduce Carissa Caban-Aleman, and I believe she's going to be talking some about the health impacts in Puerto Rico from Maria.
Definitely. Good morning. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Carissa. I work as an assistant professor at FIU and as director for behavioral health at Student Health Services. My background is in community and public psychiatry. I'm a founding member of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which is basically a group of psychiatrists and other colleagues in mental health that are trying to educate the community and our own community of colleagues about all of the grave impacts of climate change on mental health. I also have being a member of a nonprofit organization in Puerto Rico called Crear con Salud, or Create with Health, that has been working on mental health education projects since 2015. And after Hurricane Maria occurred, me being here at Miami, I was privileged again to have connections to a lot of people that were very active in sending donations and collaborating with the response, which was sincerely mainly led by nonprofit organizations and grassroots leaders. And we became sort of like another, you know, a little bit of more help with helping with disaster psychiatry response. And we started to embark on a mission to help community leaders in different municipalities and do psychological first aid and other interventions to help them with the emotional resilience aspect and surviving through what was going on and being able to stay afloat to support their communities. So I did wanted to share briefly a few slides just to frame the discussion. This is, let me see if I can quickly share these slides. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see that. If you don't, let me know. So basically, I have here a diagram from a colleague that also works with disaster psychiatry, Dr. Morgenstein, that really shows all of the basic psychological and behavioral responses that we commonly see to different kinds of disasters. And actually, this has been expanded to think about how to work with the pandemic in terms of the mental health aspects that it's exacerbating or worsening for a lot of people in our communities. In the top, you see basic distress reactions that are not necessarily going to constitute a psychiatric disorder that needs a specific treatment modality that most of us probably have experienced at some time or the other if we went through anything like a hurricane or like a scare of a hurricane. Recently in Miami, we were preparing for ETA. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to need professional treatment, but it's certainly something that decreases our productivity and that causes distress. So we have to be mindful of that and what those slow moving pieces can cause in terms of chronic consequences to our health. And we have the most common psychiatric disorders that we see with disasters, mainly depressive and anxiety symptoms. Sometimes it can cause enough distress to be a predisposing factor for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then a complex grief kind of picture where we feel like we're in a very severe state of bereavement that could last for a really long time. I still sometimes work with communities that are going through that complex grief kind of symptomatology in Puerto Rico. We are actually, CREA con Salud is giving a workshop next week virtually to a community that finally has the funds to connect with us virtually with a stable Wi-Fi and has been suffering not only with still not being recovered from Hurricane Maria, but also all of the financial limitations that the island is going through, and also the effects of some earthquakes that impacted Puerto Rico up to January of this year. And of course, dealing with the pandemic and limited access to testing and so forth, which is now thankfully getting better. So also we have to consider health risk behaviors. These are not only for the pandemic and for disasters, as it's only these are factors that always get exacerbated when anything is stressing the community in a significant level. But then I turn it to the biggest circle, which is I want to take a few minutes to really talk to you a little bit about how resilience, emotional resilience, really looks in the real world. And what I've seen in Puerto Rico and communities here in Miami that are doing great work to work on emotional resilience, on healing, and at the same time working on social justice efforts that are very helpful to mitigate the impact of climate change. And I think that that's the solution. So I think about all of this that I've seen in real life, again, very privileged and thankful for that, to see and be able to get involved with communities that are literally the examples and the heroes in making transformational resilience happen. This is a concept that some of us use in mental health care that basically points to what we can do about building a systematic process that builds on the existing strength of communities to minimize the adverse consequences of climate change and of disasters, and using these adversities as transformational catalysts to learn, grow, and increase well-being above existing levels and building better, not back to what we have that was not working right. And so when I say that, what I mean is basically that if we only recover from a hurricane by the typical response that we usually see that's led by governments or FEMA, we usually try to go back to what we had. But unfortunately, what we had include all of these social determinants of mental health and health in general, which are combined with climate change, the big detonant of why the keynote speaker was saying that climate change is really unfair and doesn't affect everybody equally. And so that's sort of like what I tend to focus on when I do my work related to disaster response, how to help the most underserved communities, which are already struggling with all of the social determinants of health that are pictured here in this diagram. For example, food insecurity, of course, poverty, low access to education, and limited healthcare capacity, and of course, housing, et cetera, et cetera. I won't have time to go over all of those. I really like this research that was published in 2019, and I just wanted to like quickly mention it. There's a lot of new energy based on, I think in the United States, based on all of the advances or the recent popularity that social justice movements have obtained. I think it might be a little bit due to that, but it was long overdue. We have to really look at the systematic biases that contribute to the health risks of climate change. And this study is particularly a really good analysis that I think is like a primary study that will lead to more research about a lot of systems of invisibilities that are very established in our institutions that really cause for some communities to really struggle more, and for climate change to actually happen by itself, because climate change is an issue of excessive consumerism, of individualistic tendencies for us to not think about the bigger picture and our little piece in the puzzle of everything that constitutes human activity in the world, the more than human world. When we turn into just thinking about ourselves and wanting to just try to be happy through consumption that is not limited to the real needs that we have, and that's actually what produces climate change in general in terms of like sort of human values. So I just wanted to point that out. I wish I could go to explaining the diagrams and how we can work with all of these invisibilities and underlying causes, but that's actually something that we all need to put our heads together to really come up with. There are really good community models that are coming actually from the people that have suffered these invisibilities that we in academia and healthcare have to really start thinking about and putting them in the table and really giving them a voice to teach us what they need from us to survive through climate change and to thrive in the midst of the adversity that are unfortunately so many communities are already facing. And I just wanted to put some pictures there of some of the things that can actually have a great impact on our mental health and our resilience capacity, that also have a great impact on climate justice efforts and on addressing climate change directly. For example, agroecologic projects that have been mentioned in this conference already, sustainable farming, our urban gardens. The picture on the bottom to the left is actually a picture from the Green Haven project in Overtown, which I recently learned about a few months ago, and I've been trying to go in and chip in when I can. It's basically a social and climate justice effort to bring food sovereignty to communities that have a big issue of food insecurity, and at the same time they're learning how to grow food without the use of pesticides or chemicals. And at the same time they're working on social cohesion, giving hope to people, and just healing together in community, which is sometimes actually, in my personal opinion, more healing than going to a therapist or taking psychiatric medications. The other pictures are some pictures of communities and projects that I've been involved with Crear con Salud. We had I wanted to show the example of how associations, professional associations, and non-governmental organizations can really chip in and make a difference. This was a donation that the American Psychiatric Association made to our organization when it was starting, formally funded in 2017. And some of the pictures to the right are projects that I've been involved with, donating filters. Sometimes, when people are in recovery in the initial stages, they're on survival mode. They're following the Maslow's hierarchy of survival needs, and you have to help them with the basic needs to really identify how they're dealing with whatever happens, for example, hurricanes mentally, and then start building a connection to see how you can put your part of the puzzle and chip in to help them recover and survive. Now, the picture on the middle on the top and the picture on the right and the bottom are two pictures from the first community workshop that I participated in after Maria. It was in November, yeah, literally 3 years ago. And that is a community program that has an alternative school for a very underserved community in the municipality of Humacao. And they were still without water or power, and it had already been more than 1 month. I think they kept going without power much longer than that, if I'm not mistaken. We did a basic training of psychological first aid, helping them with managing grief. And we kept those connections going, and we still work with these community leaders. So I'm a big believer in community and power through alliances. We really have to come together across disciplinary lines. So I just wanted to leave you with that. I don't have any more time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carissa. I appreciate that. We're going to move on to our last panelist. I encourage the audience to submit your questions into the Q&A. Dr. Kumar, we're going to try to leave a decent amount for a Q&A. I know you already spoke yesterday as part of the ECCC. So maybe you can keep your remarks brief, and we'll have a robust Q&A coming up right immediately after you.
Well, thank you, John. You're putting me in a tight spot. I thought I have 3 different data sets to share with you, but nonetheless, I think we'll try to skip some of the things. Well, I would like to thank the earlier speakers and also Dr. Katharine Hayhoe to provide excellent background. And one of the things I'm going to achieve through today's presentation is to document the precise burden of some of the disease that persist in the aftermath of extreme weather. In our case, we are going to talk about different hurricanes. So to begin with, I want to declare I have no conflict of interest in the conduct of this study, data analysis, presentation, and their interpretation. This work in part was funded by the NIEHS, one of the grant. The focus was largely to understand and investigate the health effects of environment and human health. Some of the data that is used in the study came from the University of Florida. They have a One Florida consortium. I will speak about this later on. And Clio was also kind enough to gather some data on the health effects of Hurricane Michael. So let me get started with what motivates me to undertake this research. We already know that climate change is real, and everybody has a very reliable model. A vast majority of scientists do agree on that. However, we still have incomplete knowledge about the health effects of hurricanes and for how long they persist over time. These are 2 major challenges that I hope to address through this research. In addition to this, we have major data and methodological gaps, and today I'm going to show empirically how some of these health effects can be underreported and underdiagnosed. To begin with, I want to provide you with a conceptual framework and then provide you some data on the health effects of Maria, Irma, and Michael. 2 of these hurricanes struck Florida, and of course, Maria struck Puerto Rico. And I'm going to focus on morbidity, pregnancy outcome, and mortality. As we know that health effects of hurricanes are largely dictated by the environmental conditions that are modified after the hurricane. And those all impacts are largely indirect. In terms of direct impact that we tease out that FEMA reports, they are unintentional injuries due to force wind, drowning, electrocution, or something of that sort. But the real health effects persist for a long period of time, and they are largely because of modified environmental condition, especially the air that we breathe after hurricane. For example, after hurricane, we have electricity failure, we are burning generators, we are inhaling carbon monoxide, likewise, we're inhaling particulate matter, then debris floating around, there are a lot more coarser particles. Then the home get damaged, then you have indoor mold spores floating around. On top of it, you don't have electricity, you get exposed to heat stress. In other words, when you don't have in an area like Florida, air conditioning system, and you have to open your doors and windows. So heat stress does combine further. But this doesn't really end here, because there are other host of factors that play a critical role individual behavior and choices. In other words, when the environment is being modified, how do people interact with that environment? That will dictate their exposure, and that exposure in turn will dictate their environmental stress, and related to that stress, the net magnitude of health impacts. In some of these instances, even genotypes can play a critical role. When you are exposed to adverse environmental stressors, your gene might turn on to trigger some of the disease, for example, allergies and asthma. So per se, there is a very intricate relationship between hurricane and health impacts. Often we have paid much attention to only the direct impacts, and with regard to the indirect impact that persists for a long period of time, we are still scratching the surface. As you have seen from multiple reports published even in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, the initial death toll, for example, in Puerto Rico was highly underestimated. Now this is about 3,000 deaths that were directly attributable to Hurricane Maria. And I'm going to show you some of these empirical data, not just only the mortality, but other aspects as well. So what data came from? In this study, I used 3 different data sets, clinical or emergency room visits from One Florida Alliance, a consortium. Second, I will use vital records, every single death and birth that occurred in the entire state of Florida from 2015 all the way to 2019. And then we also screened communities in 3 different areas after Hurricane Maria in Panhandle, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, after Michael in Panhandle, and in Miami-Dade after Hurricane Irma. So more information about the screening of the health effects of hurricanes, you can find these instruments at the links I have provided below. You know the location, it struck the peninsula of Hurricane Irma struck on September 10th in 2017, and of course impacted most of the area, more so the western coast of Florida. Hurricane Michael, of course, largely impacted Panhandle, and most of the peninsula of Florida was not that directly impacted by Hurricane Michael. And Maria, of course, devastated virtually most part of the island, except for the southwest part of the island. Okay, so to describe a little bit about One Florida Alliance, it's an alliance, and the University of Miami does participate in this alliance. Through this alliance, we have a network of all clinicians, emergency room. They serve about 75% of the Floridian. In other words, if there is any clinical assessment or emergency room visit, they are documented. So in other words, they are extremely comprehensive data set of a kind, I think, in the entire world. And I use some of these data to document some of these evidences. This table is complex to read, but to just summarize, this is about number of hospital encounters in clinic as well as emergency room. The last 2 columns are the emergency room visits, and the first 2 columns are the clinical visits. So 6 months before Hurricane Irma and 6 months after Hurricane Irma. Likewise, 6 months before Hurricane Irma, emergency room visits, and 6 months after. If you pay close attention to 6 months before Hurricane Irma, there were 0.74% fewer clinical visits. However, there were more clinical visits after Hurricane Irma in the emergency room to a magnitude of 2.42%. Does this mean that, of course, for unintentional injuries and life-threatening conditions, people are seeking care and clinics are closed? Because many of the regular general practice clinic, you don't generally seek care for that. As a result, people are not seeking much care in the general clinic, but they are landing up in the emergency room visit. As you already know, seeking care in emergency room visit is more expensive than in a regular clinic. On an average, let's try to figure out if there were 2.4% more clinical emergency room visits, and this translates to about 31,187 more or excess emergency room visits, and rough cost of emergency room visit is about $2,800. What does this mean is the total cost that's imposed on the emergency room visit sheer after Hurricane Irma is about $87 million. And that's the evidence which is missing from most of the literature. For any single extreme weather event you can think about, we need to tie in these numbers. How much of your tax dollar you're paying towards treating some of these conditions? Now, since there were fewer visits in the clinic, Does this mean that there were fewer morbidity burden among these people? That's not exactly right. And that's why these are one type of data set we call clinical record. Clinical record sometime may be incomplete, especially in this case after Hurricane Irma. Now let me draw your attention to two other diseases, allergies and asthma. In case of asthma, if you think about, there were 4.3% more clinical visits and 4.28 more emergency room visits. In case of allergies, there was about 4% less number of visits 6 months after Hurricane Irma. Does this mean that allergy burden was less after hurricane? That's not really correct, because in case of allergies, you don't seek care. You would like to establish anything that you lost, home you lost, or job you lost. So you are seeking less care for less life-threatening conditions. However, for life-threatening conditions, you are seeking emergency room visits, or you are going to your clinics, as you are saying. So there is a striking increase in the healthcare need for asthma, but not for allergies. So in other words, the allergy burden is highly underreported in the clinical health data sets. Then I turn to the vital record data that I acquired from Florida Department of Health. And here I'm showing you this graph. The first 4 graphs are 1 month before, 2 months before, 3 months before, and I have data for until 24 months before. And then on the right-hand side of the 4 bars, they are indicating 1 month after hurricane, 2nd month after hurricane. 2nd months after hurricane, all of a sudden there is a striking increase in number of preterm births. As you know, preterm births and low birth are highly risk factor of morbidity later in life. In both cases, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Michael. Likewise, low birth weight, as you can see, there is a tremendous spike in the low birth weight and preterm birth in Lee County. Now, the previous graph that I showed you, those were for the entire state of Florida. And these graphs are just only the county, Lee County. This is where the landfall of Hurricane Irma occurred. We are seeing the similar trend in the Bay County where the Michael struck. And as you're seeing, there was a striking increase in the low birth weight babies after Hurricane Michael. Now, moving to the summary of these data, I don't have time to go through all these, but moving to a summary of these data, there were 119 excess preterm births after Hurricane Irma. Likewise, there were 127 excess low birth weight and 2,204 excess death after Hurricane Irma. These are a striking number. This is much more higher than, roughly 10-fold higher than what is being reported by FEMA and other agencies. Okay, now let me summarize you the survey data. We screened the communities in 3 different areas, Puerto Rico, Miami-Dade, and Panhandles. Except Panhandle, all have a fairly good representation of male and female subjects. To begin with, we asked 2 questions. The general health status at the time of screening, and secondly, whether your health got worse or better after the hurricane struck. And as you can see, in terms of general health, most of them did report they are in a fairly good, very good, and excellent health, except in case of Panhandle. It looks like the Panhandle area has relatively higher morbidity burden. When we asked them the question, what was the status of your health after the hurricane? It was much better before the hurricane, better than now, same as now. In case of Maria, roughly 21% reported their health was much better before Hurricane Maria. In case of Irma, only 12% reported this. In case of Michael, as you can see, about 74% reported their health was much better before Hurricane Michael than after the hurricane. Then we screen them for various disease. Among them, 2 notable things pops up. One is the endocrine and metabolic disease syndromes, and second was PTSD. And here are some of these responses. Of those who reported they have a disease, about 58% of 1,258 reported that they have been diagnosed of any of these diseases that were mentioned in the previous slide. And as you can see, in most of the cases, in most of the cases, as you're seeing, their health condition was diagnosed after the hurricane. In case of Maria, 13% more diagnosis. In case of Irma, 8.7%. And strikingly, in case of Michael, there were 20% more diagnoses of those diseases. In other words, these conditions were initiated by the impact of hurricane. Another is time-lag diagnosis. Most of these impacts pops up after 2 to 3 months, and they peaks up at around 5 to 8 months. As you were saying, in case of Maria, the maximum was felt within 3 to 5 months, and after that, you have 26.8%. That was the highest disease burden, so roughly 8-month lag. So in other words, hurricane impacts do persist for many months. Now think about this and try to compare this with the graph, the table that I showed you from one Florida data versus survey data. Allergy burden. The question was, have you been diagnosed with allergies, and have you been diagnosed with asthma? And if so, were your allergy symptoms better before or got worse after hurricane? And likewise, the asthma, as you were saying, in case of allergies, people's allergy got worse. 60% of them reported that allergy symptom got worse after the hurricane. In case of asthma, they are reporting only about 50%, which is almost same that I showed you earlier. In other words, the clinical data are not good enough to quantify less threatening disease. That's why you need to also screen the communities for various adverse health impacts. And that figure was very striking, in which we also asked if you were pregnant during or after the hurricane. And as you're seeing, most of the birth, of course, this number is very small, about only 14, but most of them, virtually all except 2 in Miami-Dade, reported they have a preterm birth. And these numbers are very striking as well. So in summary, multiple data sets are needed to tease out the health impacts of hurricane. It does entail vital records about birth and death, which are recorded. Secondly, clinical records. In addition to this, you also need to screen communities to figure out some of the less threatening disease burden. So what are the policy implications? We need a multi-risk, we need to assess the multiple risk factors that are being exacerbated that I showed you in the conceptual framework earlier. And same thing I'm documenting, showing on the right side of this diagram. Secondly, we need multiple monitoring. What does this mean is monitoring these adverse environmental conditions. When we are sending first responders, in those responding vehicles, if we have real-time sensors about air pollution, water testing, or other conditions, that information is made available to communities, they perhaps can take more action. Likewise, we need multi-stakeholder approach. As one of the speakers was saying, we also need to build community resilience to prepare ourselves and to adapt to those anticipated changes. We already know that we are likely to see more and more hurricane given we live in Florida. For example, building infrastructure, enforcing those codes to withstand those hurricane impacts. Likewise, preparing ourselves with the hurricanes. When hurricane is approaching, in many of the instances, many of the community even don't evacuate.
Thank you,
we need.
Kumar. We have time for one question.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We are going to be ending this panel in 4 minutes at 11:55 Eastern Time. So I'm just going to ask one question and our panelists can jump in and briefly address it. What can we do to address the emotional and mental health impacts of extreme weather events on the most vulnerable populations?
Yeah, Carissa should go first.
Okay, well, there are many options. I think the first thing is to do our own inner work in our own personal lives, right? I do think that we have to really build on positive human values, mainly, I would say, like our keynote speaker emphasized, working on anything that can give us hope, a sense of more gratitude, working on compassion and tolerance, because we're going to have to, unfortunately, accept our limitations and accept that we can only do so much, right? And turning that action and that proactivity to do what we can do as a really motivating factor for hope. I would say that it starts with each of us, of course, consuming less, being very careful about, using things unnecessarily and trying to reduce and reuse. And then, in my personal opinion, the biggest thing is to see climate change as a social justice issue. In terms of the question that you asked, and supporting social justice efforts in our community. Something as simple as working on food sovereignty. When you help and support people that are trying to do urban community gardens, if you're in an urban setting, or agroecologic projects, if you're in a more rural setting, you do so much for emotional healing, for health in general. And at the same time, you're addressing climate change and you're protecting the soil that is still fertile. So that would be one example. Another project in Puerto Rico that has built a lot of hope and a lot of community empowerment that eventually leads to actually political empowerment. There's for example, a movement in Puerto Rico that has a big component on on real efforts to address climate change with different community organizations. And that is the movement of solar cooperatives that has come from the people, from very poor communities. Like, for example, the efforts of Casa Pueblo in Adjuntas. You might want to look it up. They have TED Talks and different videos in which you'll see what they've done. And they combine everything that we really need to promote, protect, and improve our healthcare in general amidst the adversities that climate change brings.
Thank you, Carissa. Kathy, briefly, and then we're done.
Destigmatize mental health care, build community, build social cohesion in communities, and reduce the temperature where people live in the day and especially at nighttime.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to wrap it up just in the interest of keeping the conference on track. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank the audience. And now I'll toss back to the conference organizers.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John.
Thank you so much, John, and all of the panelists for your amazing presentation. And now it's a point in the event where we do interactive learning. And so for everyone in the audience, we're dropping a link on the chat because it's important to address how does heat impact you personally? So on that link from the Union of Concerned Scientists, you can put in your zip code or city to learn what your heat index will look like in 20 to 30 years. If you live outside of the United States, please take a moment to find out about one of your favorite US cities. For us at the Clio Institute and the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine, located in Miami, Florida, we can actually expect about 114 days of heat above 100 degrees, danger days, where it's actually considered to be dangerous outside. So let's use the power of social media. We're dropping the link on the chat and let everyone know what you just learned. What will your city look like in 30 years with regards to extreme heat? Also follow us at Clio Institute to learn more about our programs. And without further ado, we have come to that point in our presentation where we would like to do a special recognition. I would like to welcome the chairman of the board, Daniel Deitch. He is also the former mayor of the city of Surfside. Daniel.
Okay, good morning. My name is Daniel Deitch, and on behalf of the Clio Institute's board of directors, I want to thank the entire Clio staff, our partners at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, the distinguished speakers and panelists, our sponsors, and the audience members joining from around the world. The Empowering Capable Climate Communicators Symposium has come a long way since established in 2010 by Dr. Hal Wanless. As messaged by our accomplished speakers, the climate crisis is affecting our health in ways we see and ways we can barely perceive. Events like the ECCC highlight climate impacts and provide a forum to connect, learn, and build networks to strategize the actions needed to enhance resiliency for the climate challenges we face today and those looming on the horizon. On one hand, it's so comforting to hear from our scientists, but it's critically important to amplify our messages beyond the scientific community, which is why this symposium is so aptly named. It is not just what story is being told, it is also how the story is being told. And this is why we're here. Now, I want to acknowledge someone who means a lot to Clio, a lot to the scientific community, and a lot to me, Dr. Bernard Horowitz. Bernie's been an active Clio board member since 2014, and he served as Clio board president between 2018 and 2020. Bernie's steady leadership led us through an inflection point where Clio's reach and impact scaled from Miami-Dade County to the state of Florida and now beyond. In addition to his commitment to Clio, Bernie is recognized internationally for his research on blood viral safety and the preparation and characterization of new therapeutics from blood. His career was marked by corporate leadership positions and his service on multiple scientific advisory boards. He has served as a scientific consultant to the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Hemophilia Foundation, the International Association of Biological Standardization, and the World Health Organization. And throughout his career, he has been recognized by his peers for his work. Bernie, I want to thank you for your service, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Just let me know you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. First, let me say how much I'm enjoying this symposium. The breadth and depth of the talks are just wonderful. And I think congratulations goes to Yoka and the whole team who's put it together. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. and Professor Hal Wanless, the longtime head of the Department of Geology here at the University of Miami, and the creator of the symposium, the symposium that we now call the ECCC, or Educating Climate Change Communicators. It's now in its 10th year. I first met Hal in 2012 as a 68-year-old student at that year's ECCC. It was held on 4 Saturdays here at the University of Miami, 4 full days of talks and slides given largely by scientists from the University of Miami, NOAA, and NASA. Speakers included Brian Sodom, John Van Leer, David Enfield, and many others. And the talk titles, not too dissimilar from what's going on, although the depth is very different: warming oceans, ice melt, bullets on Greenland, corals, health, and many others. On behalf of Clio, Carolyn led a breakout session providing advice and instruction on the need and best ways of communicating climate change to our friends and colleagues. At that time, I brought a scientist's natural degree of skepticism as well as curiosity to the presentations. I asked questions, as I hope you all do, challenged conclusions. After 4 immersive days, I was convinced that climate change was real, its impacts disastrous without prompt and appropriate mitigation. I joined Clio as a consequence, first as an advisor, then as a board member, and as Daniel just described, as the board chairman. Hal's knowledge and insights applying geological history, which typically is measured in hundreds of thousands and millions of years, to today's crisis, which we can measure almost yearly, but certainly over decades, is unparalleled, and his influence is immeasurable. We've all benefited from his willingness to share that knowledge and to act in accord with it in both private and public spheres. 10 years ago, the conversation was mostly restricted to scientists, with maybe 3 or 4 news reports per year. Today, as witnessed by the symposium, virtually every department at the University of Miami has taken a role in addressing the climate change crisis, as have many elements from the various sectors of our society. Many of us have Hal's willingness to share his knowledge and his acumen from the very earliest days, and we have him to thank for our involvement. At the board level, I can tell you his words continue to motivate us all. So he continues to be our scientific soul. So without further delay or ado, Hal, please welcome Hal Wanless, the founder of ECCC and long-term board member of the Clio Institute, as well as decades and decades of performing and communicating science to the community. Hal?
Okay, it's nice to be here. I'd just like to spend a minute or two giving a little history. Back in 2006 or 7, Miami-Dade County commissioners started a climate change advisory task force that was headed by Harvey. We put out reports. I was the chair of the science committee, warning that this was real and that it was serious and it was bigger than what the IPCC was projecting for sea level rise. Somewhere about 2010, I asked Harvey, I said, where's the educational component? We had all kinds of other things going on. And he said, let me ask the commissioners. And he came back and said, they don't want one. Well, as I think everybody here knows, the only way that we can get people to understand the scope, seriousness, reality, immediacy, urgency of climate change is to educate others. And so I decided to start an educational thing in 2000, I guess it was 11. And my fiance, Lynn Bauer, then suggested that we name it Empowering Capable Climate Communicators. And another colleague suggested I must invite Carolyn Lewis, who I did not know. And that's obviously, it grabbed her attention. In the first year it was offered, another 4 Saturday series. And she then ran with it, taking Clio from whatever it was going to do and turn it entirely to climate awareness, communication, and action. And it's been such a pleasure to watch this grow from something little that we were struggling just to have it survive to something that now is throughout Florida. And Yoka and Caroline and everybody else is to be admired for that. If I could have just another 2 minutes, I would love it. And if I could share my screen, that would be really nice. Can I do that?
Yes, you do have sharing capabilities, Dr. Wellness.
Good. What I want to do is show you a diagram here that I put together. Actually, I took the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide level graph, and on that, I decided to plot 2 things. One, the different presidential terms of the different presidents up through Trump this time. And what you can see from that is globally, and this is a global problem, we have had little or no influence on slowing down the carbon dioxide buildup. It keeps accelerating, and this is horrendously disturbing. The other thing I just want to show you on this diagram, back in 1980, I've drawn a green line, when we were at about 340 parts per million CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That was the year that the US really for the first time started looking at the seriousness and the urgency and realizing it was serious and urgent to do something. And then the US government and oil companies and others found a way to just put it off for a little while doing anything. At that time, looking back at our geologic past, we were already committed to about 10 meters of sea level rise, because that's last time we were at 340, that's what it was. And then when we hit 400 parts per million, we're at something like 21 meters of rise committed, and because that's what it was in the past. This is a very important diagram because we fiddle around moving around the deck chairs on the Titanic, but we haven't gotten in as a leadership nation or even a follower nation into doing what we need to do to get hold of this problem. And we're very fortunate today to have Katharine Hayhoe here, who's one of the outstanding communicators in our country and probably the world about communication. So thank you very much for acknowledging a little bit of the history here. And I turn it back to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace, for your incredible work and your support of the Clio Institute. And now we'd like to welcome back Dr. Hayhoe and Carolyn Lewis for the final session of our symposium, The Power of Communication. Dr. Hayhoe.
Well, let me start, Natty. So I think Dr. Wallace, really and truly, you should be very proud, and I know you are, of the trajectory of this particular annual celebration of climate science and building communication. And you are right. Dr. Hayhoe probably is the world's best communicator. And it is our pleasure at the Clio Institute to have her come back after her keynote to lead us in understanding how she does it and how she does it so well. So the main thing, just let me close this door. The main thing I want you all to know about Dr. Hayhoe is she's a born teacher as well as an astrophysicist. When I think of an astrophysicist, I think about the Big Bang. And when I think about the Big Bang, I think about, oh my God, they could use a dose of Katharine Hayhoe right about now. But she's going to spend the next 45 minutes or so to an hour doing three things. For the first 10 or 15 minutes, she's going to teach us, give us tips on communicating about climate. For the second 10 or 15 minutes, she's going to tell us stories of what she's experienced in her work as a climate scientist and a climate communicator. And then in the final session, we are going to have a Q&A with her. And so we're going to ask you to go ahead and send your questions to the link that Dr. Hayhoe is dropping into the chat right now as we speak. So without further ado, audience, think about your questions as she speaks. Jot them down on the link she shared. It's different from our Q&A chat on the Zoom link. And then we will enjoy learning from her, listening to her stories, and getting to ask her some profound questions. Take it away, Dr. Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. So we spoke earlier about how climate change is affecting us here and now, and how the fact that we don't think it matters to us is a much bigger problem than the people who say that the science isn't real. But now I want to dig a little bit deeper into how do we actually have these tough conversations on climate change. And as you go along, you're going to be able to ask questions at any point. So as we're talking about climate change, you can go to the link in the chat, or if for some reason you can't see it, go to pollev.com/Katharine. That's my name. You have to make sure to spell it right. I've got 2 A's in there. pollev.com/Katharine. And at any point you can enter a question you have, but here's the fun part. You can also upvote other people's questions, because I'm anticipating you'll probably have a lot of questions and we won't have time to get to all of them. But if you go to pollev.com/Katharine, you can look at the questions other people have asked, and you can give a thumbs up to the ones that you most want Carolyn and I to discuss afterwards. So again, even if you don't have a question, check it out, because you'll see the other questions there, and that'll give you a sense of, hey, I really want to, oh, that's a good question. Oh yeah, so upvote the ones that you want, and we'll get to those at the end. You can do this anytime throughout the presentation. If you missed the link, just go back to the chat. It's right there. First of all, though, I want to set the stage. We are facing a very difficult challenge when it comes to talking about climate change. How difficult? Well, the United States back 25, 26 years ago was not very polarized. The average Democrat and the average Republican were closer together than they were to the tails of their own party. But over time, that has shifted. 2011, 2017, only people who voted in 2017. There is a huge gap now between people based on their political affiliation. And what falls into that gap? A lot of issues. But climate change is number one. Because it turns out that the number one predictor of whether we agree with 200 years of science telling us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and we need to act now. It's not how educated we are, it's not how much science we know. It is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. As of last February, climate change was the number one most politicized issue in the whole country, and it has held that spot since the Obama administration. What you're seeing here is you're seeing where Republicans fall in terms of is this issue a priority, where Democrats fall, and then the width of the gray bar tells you how far apart they are. So the wider the gray bar, the more that issue is politicized. And we see lots of issues on this list. We see the economy, budget, poverty, race, education. But right at the top, we've got climate change and environmental protection. Now, this was back in February. What does this look like today? We've got coronavirus, we've got Black Lives Matter. How has this changed? Well, we have the answer, and here it is. Now, this isn't organized by the width of the gray bar, but I will point it out for you. The number 3 most politicized issue, the 3rd widest gray bar, is the coronavirus pandemic. How did a virus get politicized? Then number 2 is racial and ethnic inequality. And what's number 1? Climate change. Not only that, but this brand new survey from the Pew Foundation, they found that the United States is unique. It is exceptional in the nature of its political divide. So the US is the most polarized country in the world, and climate change is the most polarized issue in the United States. So that means if we can figure out how to have constructive, positive conversations about climate change in the United States, we can talk about anything. This is the hardest thing to do. So how do we go about that? Well, most people, when we say, okay, have a conversation about climate change, we think, here's what we need to do. We need to get our mental dump truck and we need to load it up with all the facts and the data and the science. And I'm not a scientist, so what am I going to do about that? And we just need to dump that avalanche of information, data, and scary facts on people, and surely they'll change their minds, right? Well, it turns out from the social science that lack of information or education or intelligence is not the problem. As researcher Dan Kahan has found, I like to show you pictures of people so you know who these people are. Dan found that people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned about climate change, they were most polarized on the issue. In fact, he went on to find that the smarter you are, the better you are at cherry picking the information off the internet that shows why you're right. Yes. And then neuroscientist Tali Sharot explains in her TED Talk here that our brains are programmed to get a kick out of information. We like information, but people only accept new information if they already believe it. If it contradicts what they believe, their brain just shuts off. And she didn't stop there, it gets worse. She also found that in this internet era where you can Google anything, the wealth of information available makes us more resistant to change because, again, it's so easy to find data that supports our pre-existing opinion. If somebody says the earth is round and we believe it's flat, we just Google a YouTube video and say, oh, see, this person says it's flat. Never mind that that person may be filming it from their parents' basement, whereas every astrophysicist in the world says it's round. We can find the evidence on the internet. And it gets worse. As we are exposed to contradicting information and opinions, it expands our polarization. So loading up the dump truck and dumping it on people actually makes the situation worse, not better. So that's what not to do. What should we do? Rather than assuming that it's lack of facts or information or intelligence that's causing our problem, because it isn't, we have to recognize what the real problems are. And you're going to notice I like 3s. The 3 real problems we have are identity politics, complacency because, as I talked about in my first talk, we think climate change is a distant issue far away rather than here and now, and solution aversion. We think the solutions are worse than the impacts. Let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, we think that somehow a thermometer gives us a different answer depending on how we vote. Then with psychological distance, as I showed earlier, we agree that global warming is real and it will harm plants and animals and people in developing countries and future generations, but we don't think it affects us. And I'm going to zoom in on Florida here just for a second. Miami-Dade County is the one where 56% of people, 56, only half the people, barely over half in Miami-Dade think climate change will affect them personally, even though it's already affecting property prices today, as we saw. And then the next county there is 51%. And then all the other counties are less than 50%. Less than half the people in Florida think that it will affect them personally, which is stunning. And in fact, I just saw a survey that showed that when they asked people in Florida, why are your homes and why are your roads and businesses, why are things flooding more frequently? The most common answer, you know what it was? Bad storm sewers. That was the most common answer. It wasn't sea level rise from climate change. So people don't understand the connection. And then the last one there is solution aversion. What does that mean? It means that we are told all the time that the solutions to climate change are bad. Like what? Well, I thought this was classic. Here's Marco Rubio saying, I don't want to destroy the economy over climate. And I would agree, I don't want to destroy the economy either. But the economy doesn't float around in outer space without our lives. What you can see here, this subhead is just absolutely ironic. You know, several million Florida homes at risk due to climate change. Won't that affect the economy? It will. We care about climate change because it affects the economy. So how do we break this vicious cycle? We break it by sharing the right kind of information with people who don't have it. And this is something else that's really important that I learned when I started to talk to people about climate change. We aren't just two groups of people, yes or no, believers or deniers. We actually fall across a spectrum. And 26% of us are already very alarmed about climate change. We are the ones who see headlines like methane levels have hit a scary high, extraordinary increase in coastal flooding, Greenland is melting, there's a countdown clock in New York. And that information works with us to make us alarmed. But if we're alarmed, what do we need to know? We need to know what to do with that alarm. Because if you're just alarmed and you don't have a solution, you get paralyzed, you're frozen. You get overloaded with anxiety and eventually you dissociate from it. You can't bear that anxiety without knowing what to do with it. So if somebody's alarmed, they desperately need to know, what do I do about it? And there's a fantastic TED Talk by Renee Lertzman, and there'll be a link hopefully that you can put into the chat right now to her TED Talk. There's a fantastic TED Talk on how when we are anxious, the solution is action. So with people who are alarmed, they already know that it's bad. We need to talk about what we can do. That is what we desperately need. Then at the other end of the spectrum, at the other end, we have people who are dismissive. Who are people who are dismissive? Well, my personal definition of them is someone who, if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame appeared to them, they wouldn't change their minds. So why would I think I can? I can't. I don't think there is any point engaging with the dismissive. But you know what? 93% of us are not dismissive. And people who are concerned or cautious often lead with their doubts. How are we going to fix this? Won't it be too expensive? I heard somebody said it was just volcanoes. Or are you sure sea level rise is the reason why we're flooding? They lead with their doubts and they need to be reassured. So just because somebody sounds doubtful, don't automatically assume they're dismissive. A dismissive person is obsessed with rejecting climate change. They'll bring it up any chance they have. They won't listen to a thing that you say. They would argue with a stump if the stump said climate wasn't changing. But everybody else might have doubts and questions, but they're not dismissive. And so with those people, we can talk about how climate change affects us here and now to address psychological distance and all the positive things we can do to fix it. I said I liked threes. So here's your second three. I've actually got 3 threes. Isn't that perfect? So what was the first 3? The first 3 was the real problems: identity politics, psychological distance, and solution aversion. What's the second 3? What we can do to combat this. Yes, we can bond over shared values, something we genuinely have in common. we can connect the dots between how climate change is affecting our lives today to address psychological distance, and we can provide real world examples of positive, inspiring solutions to show people that it isn't about destroying the economy. In fact, it's about saving it and us with it. Like what? Well, we can bond over the place where we live. What's happening where we live? We can bond over being a parent or a grandparent. We can bond over a shared faith, an activity that we enjoy, experiences that we've had in common, our profession. There are so many things that we can bond over that don't have to overtly have anything to do with climate change, but of course they do, because why do we care? We care about climate change because it affects the place we live. It affects our family, because our faith has something to say about how we respond to global issues, because it might affect an activity that we enjoy, because it might affect our profession. These are why we care. So once we figured out how we can connect with somebody, which we do by listening to them and getting to know them, right? Then we can talk about why it matters to us. For example, if we live in Florida, we see droughts, we see extreme heat, which the panel talked about the incredible negative impacts on our health. We see stronger hurricanes, we see rising sea levels. We see things here and now that put us all at risk. And here's an interesting thing. Chris Chu is a researcher from my university, Texas Tech, and he found out that when we talk about how climate change affects us here and now, it's a twofer. That's a Canadianism if you're not familiar with it. What that means is you get two for the price of one, right? And so he found that when we talk about how climate change affects us here and now, it actually decreases our political polarization too. And that is great news. So bonding, connecting, and step 3 is inspiring, talking about real solutions. I talk about what I've done, my light bulbs, my plug-in car, my solar panels, reducing food waste, trying out meatless Mondays. I talk about what people are doing in the places where we live. In my previous presentation, I highlighted some Florida examples, and there are dozens of examples of amazing things that are happening in Florida that you can find out about and you can talk about. Talk about what farmers are doing about climate change. Talk about what religious communities are doing about climate change. Talk about what businesses are doing about climate change. Even oil and gas businesses, although that might be a little questionable still, at least they're starting to talk about it, which is good news. I mentioned earlier Project Drawdown, the hundreds of solutions that have to do with farming, ecosystem restoration, indigenous people's land management, smart heating and cooling, and of course the solar panels, and of course the wind turbines, but there's so much more. So when we're talking about climate change, people aren't hearing enough about it, right? But if we overload them with doom and gloom, it just paralyzes them. And many of us might already feel paralyzed today. We're already alarmed. And when we just guilt people, that actually turns them off. Studies have shown that if you wave a judgy finger at somebody, surprise, surprise, they're less likely to go along with what you say. So instead, if we can talk about locally relevant impacts and constructive solutions, many of which have short-term benefits, that is where people want to hear more about it. And research shows that spurring conversations really does make a difference. It creates a true positive feedback loop, where the more you know, the more concerned you are. The more concerned you are, the more you talk about it. The more you talk about it, the more people around you know. It is time to break the climate silence. And now you know how to do that. So that was the first half of this session. And then for the second half, Carolyn has asked me to do something that I've actually never done before so formally, but I love this. She asked me to tell you some stories. So I'm going to give you my last set of 3. Remember, the first 3 was our real problems. The second 3 was how to tackle those through bonding, connecting, and inspiring. And what's my last set of 3? My last set of 3 related to climate stories are 3 key steps to success when you're following the bond, connect, and inspire model. What are these 3 key steps? The first key step is that it is really difficult, sometimes even impossible, to have a constructive conversation with somebody who's dismissive. Why? Because a dismissive person won't listen to anything you say. It's almost as if they have a physical blockage in their ears that makes them unable to actually let anything you say in. And so it is very difficult, if not impossible, to have a positive conversation with a dismissive person. The second key is that there has to be mutual respect, which means that we view each other as a human being with value who we are willing to listen to. And that's on us too. It's not just on the person we're talking to. In fact, the person we're talking to might extend that respect to us if they feel like they're getting it from us first. So instead of coming in with a superior attitude or a judgmental attitude or a I will teach you attitude or a you don't have the right values, so I will tell you what you should be doing, coming in with an attitude of respect and of curiosity, wanting to engage and ask questions of people, find out more about them, what makes them tick. If they say something you disagree with, ask them why they feel that. Get them to dig into it and explain and find points of agreement. Because the last point is we have to have points of agreement, and the earlier they come in the conversation, the better the conversation will be. If you begin a conversation immediately by butting heads with somebody, the chances of that conversation ending up going well immediately dropped. Whereas if you begin with something you agree on, or if you can pivot quickly to something you agree on, the chances of that conversation going well have just soared. So sometimes with the same person, you might be butting heads with them, and that's not the time to bring in climate change in a constructive way. That's probably the time to step away, cool down, reflect, and try again later when you've looked for a way that you can agree with them. All right, so let me give you some examples that highlight these situations. And I have had probably thousands of conversations with people over the years. And so this is kind of fun because I'm gonna kind of dig into my memory to try to give you some examples. So first of all, dismissive people, although they're only 7% of the population, they're very vocal. So most of the people who ask me negative questions or attack me on social media are dismissive. And what I've found through experimenting on thousands of people is that with the dismissive person, if you say, well, that's a good question here, and you give them a link that answers that question because there's nothing new under the sun. In fact, there's a great website called skepticalscience.com that has answers to every sciencey sounding objection you've ever heard and then some. Dismissive people can't click on it. They literally cannot click. They will lie and say they did when they didn't. They will say that they did and it didn't answer their question, or they will bait you and they'll be like, oh, so you call yourself a scientist and you can't answer my question. It's like, well, I just sent you something that did. Oh no, you can't answer it yourself. And it's like, this is the 800th time somebody has asked me this question. I'm just going to give you this link so you can look at it. So that's on social media. Nearly everybody I hear from in a negative way is dismissive. And I've learned that there is no point engaging with them beyond maybe just once to determine that they are dismissive. And if they are, I'm done. I think it truly takes a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. And while as a Christian, I do believe in the occasional miracle, I don't believe that I had anything to do with it. So I have examples of conversations with dismissives almost every day on social media. But let's move on to the mutual respect one. With mutual respect, I've learned through listening to people that often they have really good reasons to not accept that we need to take action on climate change. And one of my first conversations on this was with my husband. My husband is a really smart person. He has a PhD in applied linguistics. And because of that, I just assumed we're on the same page on climate change. And when I learned that we weren't, I was very surprised. But because I knew he was so smart, rather than saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you don't agree with the science, I was curious and I said, why not? I figured he must have good reasons. So that led to many constructive conversations, not one or two, but gradually spaced over weeks and even months, where he kind of unpacked what he was concerned about. And then together we went to find information to answer those concerns. I actually learned more than he did, I think. But that was the way that we were able to engage, because I started the conversations assuming that he had good reasons for what he believed, and I was curious in finding out more about them. Now, that doesn't always work. And I'll give you an example of a place where it didn't work because there wasn't mutual respect. I was asked to meet with a Texas politician. And typically I don't meet with politicians unless they actually want to meet with me, because if somebody doesn't want to meet with you, there's not going to be mutual respect. But I was assured that, you know, they really wanted me to meet with him, and he had agreed to, and he knew who I was and what I stood for. So I said, okay, I'll try. So I researched him, and I found out that he had a passion for a certain type of nonprofits that I actually knew something about. And so I researched that. And when I went to meet him, I could tell immediately he was just sort of looking past me over my head. So I shook his hand and I said, well, I know that you're very interested in this. And actually, I've been doing some of that too myself. And he just lit up like a candle. He's like, really? That's fantastic. I've actually written a book about that. Would you like me to send it to you? So I said, oh, yes, that would be great. So bonding, right? But then here's where it fell apart. There was no mutual respect. As soon as I went off the topic of his pet thing, his eyes glazed over, his gaze went over my head, and he didn't listen to a thing I said. There was no mutual respect there. And so frankly, I felt like I'd wasted my time, and it reaffirmed that if somebody is not going to give you the courtesy of listening to you, even when you've done your best to listen to them first, it's not going to be constructive. It's time to just back away, move on. There might be somebody else they do respect, somebody else who he might actually respect, who could have the conversation with him later on, and it wasn't me. And that's okay. All right. Now for the last story. And don't forget, you can be posting your questions anytime. So you can post them on pollev.com/Katharine, my name. Link is in the chat right here. And you can post your questions and we will be discussing them. But don't forget, you can also upvote the questions that you're most interested in. And that's the fun part, because you can ask the questions, but you can also see what questions people are asking. And then you can upvote the questions that you most want to see Carolyn and I discuss. So go ahead and do that too. But my last question, or my last story, I should say, and actually, let me just check to make sure that that's working, that people, oh yes, people are definitely asking questions. They're there. Excellent. My last story relates to starting with something you agree on rather than something you disagree on. And this story began a number of years ago when I was asked to present at a conference in the UK for scientists who are Christians. I was asked specifically to talk about the connection between science and faith when it comes to climate change. And so typically when I speak to US audiences, which as you know are very, very polarized, I usually spend quite a bit of time explaining why climate is changing, how we know humans are responsible. It really isn't natural cycles or volcanoes or the sun. It really is humans. We have checked over the last 100 years, and the impacts are serious and we need to act. So I spend a lot of time explaining that. But the organizers of the conference in the UK said, oh, you don't have to worry about that. Everybody here is on board with the science. Just go ahead and talk about what your faith means and how it informs what you do and why you care about climate change. So I said, wow, that sounds great. I'd be happy to do that. So I talked a lot about how we are supposed to be responsible for every living thing on this planet, how we are to care for creation, how we are to care for those less fortunate than us, who are those who are most affected by the impacts of a changing climate. And at the end of my presentation was our tea break, because it was in England. So everybody went outside and they were sitting on picnic tables having their tea. And I was talking to several women at the conference, and they were asking me questions about all of the gender-based attacks that I received, because most of the people who attack me are men, and they often use very gender-based language when they approach me, which could range from handmaiden of the Antichrist to Jezebel and more. So we were having this conversation when a man came storming up to our table, and he was outraged. Without even saying hi, he just immediately broke into, how could you say climate change is real? Nobody knows that it is for sure. Nobody's checked to see if it's just natural variability. And he just went into this diatribe about how we don't know, and it was irresponsible of me to say that we do, even though we do know. And he could not believe that I, as a scientist, would actually have the gall to say something like that at a conference. And so here I am, I have received things like that before, but not in the UK. And all the poor women at my table who'd just been asking me about this, they were just sitting there with their teacups like this, frozen, that they had a real-time example actually happening in real life about what they'd just been asking me for. So that conversation was not going to go anywhere positive. So I just ended it with saying, I'm sorry that we have to disagree, and I strongly recommend that you update your understanding based on the science, because what you are saying is not correct. But I didn't expect that that would influence him. And I don't think it did. But then a year later, I went to a conference in Canada. And the only reason I went to this conference was because my dad was presenting at it. And he said, well, why don't you come along for the day? So I thought, sure, the sessions will be interesting. I'll come. So we went to this conference. I went to my dad's session. It was very good. We went to lunch and got cornered by a dismissive person at lunch, different person, who was telling us that all those climate scientists were corrupt and venal and they would be paid money to fake the data. And at one point during lunch, I leaned across the table to him. I said, I'm one of those scientists. So you think I'm being paid to fake the data? And he just kind of looked at me like this, and then he just went off on a different tack. So I left the lunch early. I walked out of the dining hall. The door slammed behind me, and I realized I'd come out of the wrong door. I didn't know where I was on campus. So I went to open the door back up, and it was locked, and my phone was dead. So here I was standing in the middle of this campus. There was not a single person in sight. It was the middle of the summer. The door behind me was locked. My phone was dead. I didn't know what to do. And then I heard the door behind me opening. So I turned around, and sadly, before I could say anything, the door slammed and locked again. And guess who it was? It was the man from England. I looked at him. He looked at me. I took a deep breath. I could see him taking a deep breath. We both resolved to be civil and not to mention the C word. And I said, well, do you happen to know how to get back to the conference? He said, well, I'm not totally sure, but let's try. So we walked along together, and I could see that he was visibly struggling for a new topic of conversation that was polite. And he happened to look down at my bag, and he saw that I had my knitting needles sticking out of my bag because I like to knit at conferences. He said, oh, do you knit? I said, yes, I do. I said, I'm making a gift for my mother. Her birthday's next week. And he said, oh, I knit too. I said, really? And he said, yes, and I don't believe that we should be buying presents for our loved ones. It just increases consumerism and all that plastic from China. Our family makes all of our presents for each other. I said, wow, that's amazing. I love that. So after I expressed enthusiasm, he kind of warmed to his theme. He said, actually, I've made all our furniture. We upcycle packing crates and I turn it into furniture, or we get it secondhand. We live in a small apartment near the center of the city. I don't have a car, and I only take one international trip a year. And I thought to myself, well, wasn't it my luck that this was the international trip? But the more we talked, the more I realized that he lived the most low carbon life of nearly anybody I talked to. When we got to the door of the conference, I turned to him. I said, you know what? I said, I wish everybody thought the same way as you did about climate change, but I wish everybody lived like you did. And he looked at me and he said, really? I said, yes, really. And we never saw each other again.
Woo, that was beautiful. That was just amazing. Dr. Hayhoe, you really are a superhero, I tell you. And I couldn't tell you how much I agree with you on everything. I think the audience is clapping, but because we're on a Zoom platform, you cannot hear them. But I feel that energy coming. We have a lot of questions. Take as long as you want answering them, or as short as you want. I will just feed them to you, and you just have some fun with them, all right?
Okay.
Are you ready?
Good. Yes, I'm ready. And as you guys listen, remember, you can still be upvoting questions and moving them around and adding more. So go for it.
And let me just say, if anybody didn't get onto the link to ask questions, there was a typo in one of them. So we re-uploaded it again on the chat. So try again if you didn't get in, but I see a lot of you got in. So number one, Dr. Hayhoe, in light of the political polarization, do you think climate activists who really want change should emphasize the bipartisan legislation like a carbon fee and dividend, or go more intrusive or more bold, I would say, with legislation like the Green New Deal?
Well, the answer to that, which I hope you've kind of seen from the way I've been talking about climate change, is it depends who you're talking to. There is no magic formula. So again, for those of us who are alarmed, scary information from the science made us alarmed. But for people who aren't alarmed, more scary information just shuts them off. In terms of solutions, people who already are a fan of a free market economy, they'll like solutions that can work in a free market economy. People who are more concerned about fair and equitable government policy, they will like solutions that specifically promote fair and equitable government policy. Here's the thing though, even those solutions that were mentioned in the question, like carbon pricing, for example, or the Green New Deal, those solutions, if you dig into them and you actually ask people, not about their titles, but you ask people about what they really accomplish, most people across the whole political spectrum are on board with everything they have to accomplish. And in fact, when the Green New Deal was first released in December 2018, 57% of conservative Republicans and over 72% of moderate Republicans supported it. Does that not blow your mind? And now, of course, we're like in the 30% of Republicans support it. What changed? Not the Green New Deal. What changed was the way politicians and conservative media pundits talked about it. So people don't really have a problem with the real solutions. They have a problem with how they're presented politically. So if you talk specifically about components of the Green New Deal, without mentioning the words green and new and deal, if you talk about components of it, people might be very on board with those. But if you mention the politicized word, immediately it's like an article of faith. If you're a registered Republican, you don't go along with that. So don't step on the mines. It's like in a climate conversation, you're picking your way across a minefield. Don't deliberately put your foot on a mine. Share information that you know people will get on board with. And in the Yale program on climate communication that I talked about, what I didn't share is that they have a lot of questions they ask people about solutions. Are you on board with a certain solution? So I want to actually share this with you on my screen just briefly. There we go. I want to share this with you very briefly because I think it's very illuminating how when you ask people not, do you want to fix the environment at the cost of the economy? That's a false dichotomy. But when you ask people questions like, do you want to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant? All of a sudden, you get some astonishing results. You get 75% of the country says, yes, I support regulating carbon as a pollutant. Isn't that amazing? Do you support requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a tax? Yes, people do support that. That's 68% of people. Do you support tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Oh my goodness, that is dark orange. So people's real opinions about real solutions are actually very consistent, but it's when it gets a political label smacked onto it, that's where we see the disagreement. So do everything you can to avoid those political labels and focus on real solutions that help real people.
That's beautiful. And it kind of makes sense. There are people who are supporting the carbon dividend, and there are people who are supporting the Green New Deal who are now fighting with each other. And that just makes no sense. It's like we need all of the above. Break down the components. And this is your amazing skill. You know that big picture, small detail. You know how to break down those minds so that we avoid them. Let me ask you a follow-up question. Individual action is important, we know. But we could make much more gains if we get countries and companies to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. Would it make sense to focus our climate communication and advocacy on the big issues, the bigger gains, countries and companies, rather than family and friends and members, like members of your family like that? What balance do you strike?
Yes. So I said earlier that I love threes, and I'm going to give you another three. Hopefully it makes it easy to remember. I actually use it as a memory trick. If I'm going to the grocery store and I don't have a pen, I try to remember things in threes. Okay, so the threes I have is this. The first most important thing we can do is to use our voice to talk about why climate change matters and what real solutions look like. That's number one. Number two is advocate for change within our spheres of influence. Because working together in a community is much more powerful than a single person. So how do we do that? We might be a person who attends a school. We might work for a business or a company. We live in a city. We live in a county. We live in a state. Whatever sphere of influence we are in, our place of worship, the yoga studio that we go to, use our voice to advocate for change in that community. And in fact, some people have even deliberately become stakeholders in large corporations specifically to advocate for change within those corporations. And then what's number three? Vote. Not just in the presidential election, although we certainly saw the power of voting there, but vote for the city. In Texas, one of the most important positions in terms of regulating our greenhouse gas emissions is the railroad commissioner. It's a total misnomer, but they regulate all of the flaring of methane gas from the West Texas oil fields. And nobody really understands that voting for the railroad commissioner of Texas could actually have one of the most significant impacts on greenhouse gas emissions other than voting for the president of the United States. So using your power in a democratic society to talk, to advocate, and to vote is absolutely essential. And of course, I talk about my individual actions, but if I recycled, changed my light bulbs, drove a plug-in car, didn't eat any more meat, reduced my food waste, had solar panels on the roof, and that's all I did, my difference would be minuscule. The biggest difference I make is by raising my voice and by telling people about why this matters and what we can all together do to fix it.
And may I suggest that what you have also done is you've increased your circle of influence. And I think people can do that. Our circle of concern is much bigger than our circles of influence. But you're a scientist, and a lot of scientists just want to stay in their little boxes and they don't want to get out. You took your concern and you opened up your circle of influence by being a climate communicator. And so I think people, like you said, run for office and get a bigger megaphone to advocate for what you want. And so I thank you for that answer. It makes a lot of sense, and I hope the audience is pleased with that. So we have another question. Can you tell us a story about your most difficult climate conversation and how you approached it? That might have been the last one you just told us. That was so good, about that man with the knitting. But are there others?
Yes, I have had many difficult conversations. So I don't know what I would say is the most difficult one, but I would say probably, and this is probably true for all of us, the closer we are to the person, the harder it is.
Yes, yes, yes.
So when we have family members or people we've known for a very long time, those conversations are harder than if it's somebody who we don't know so well. So I have an uncle, and my uncle is an engineer, and for some reason, engineers are disproportionately more likely to have a problem with climate science than other fields. And so for many years, he confined his objections to my dad. He would be emailing my dad and having conversations with my dad and bringing it up at family events. And he respects my dad because my dad is also a scientist and educator. They're the same age, you know, they're both men. So there was a spirit of mutual respect, and he would listen to my dad, although he would never change his mind. One day though, he decided he was just going to go for it. And he sent me an email, and it was a long email, and it was full of objections that I've heard many times before, many. So I took the approach of saying, well, those are good questions, and here are resources that answer your questions. And I sent that to him, expecting that he would, you know, take the time to look at those resources. He fired back a reply almost immediately. And he said, well, you look very cute in that video you sent me. But as my colleague, Dr. So-and-so says, who of course had no experience whatsoever in climate science, you know, you did not consider this major factor. And so I said, at that point, I thought, what should I do? So I asked my aunt, and my aunt said, Katharine, in my email to you, sent on May 6th, I told you, do not talk to your uncle about this. It will not make any difference. And I was like, oh my goodness, I just fell into my own hole. I tell everybody else to just disengage from dismissives. And what did I do? I just did it myself. And somebody else had to tell me with perfect truth, don't do it. There is no point to it. So that is a case where not only was it a difficult conversation, that it ended where, you know, I didn't say anything bad back to him, but it ended in a way that certainly didn't feel satisfactory. But the most important lesson I learned was, wow, I wasn't even taking my own medicine.
It's a good point. So I'm going to combine the next two questions because they're pretty good. They're asking about going to talk about climate change over Thanksgiving dinner, hopefully very small family pods for Thanksgiving dinner, not into bigger circles. How would you talk about it? not turn off your crazy uncle or somebody who's ultra religious and believes the earth is only 6,000 years old?
Okay, well, I have 2 resources for you where I actually answer those exact questions. The first resource is a webinar that I did for young evangelicals for climate action a year ago this week on how to have Thanksgiving conversations with your relatives. I literally made the webinar. So they just shared it again on social media today, which is what I saw. Yes, and I'm going to drop that link in the chat right here so you can watch it at your leisure. Here it is, just a second. Here we go. Okay, and then we have a little series on YouTube called Global Weirding. It's a PBS digital series. And much to my absolute surprise, the most popular episode out of 35 episodes is, what does the Bible say about climate change? And in that episode, I address all of the questions like, how do you talk about climate change if somebody doesn't think the earth is old? And my answer is, we only have to agree the earth is 300 years old to agree that humans are changing climate because of the Industrial Revolution. And as far as I know, we all agree it's at least 300 years old. So I'll put a link to Global Weirding in here too, and check out our most popular episode as well as other ones. We have ones on climate change impacts in the Southeast, for example. But the most popular one is, what does the Bible say about climate change?
That's great, wonderful resources. And with respect to a smaller, intimate family, which you alluded to in the previous question, non-religious arguments, and you have a crazy uncle who's the only one that's a climate denier, and the others are really concerned about urgency and agency. How do you bridge that divide around the table? Can you?
Well, that's where I think really doing your homework, which I've had to do as a scientist, on what real solutions look like is so important. So as a scientist, we study the problem, we diagnose the problem, we tell people how bad it is, but we don't fix it. That's not what we do. And so I have had to really educate myself on what's happening. So I specifically look for stories of what's happening where I live, in Texas, for example, that I can talk about with people in Texas. I specifically look for surprising stories, like what farmers are doing or what the military is doing or what faith leaders are doing. I look for stories that relate to who I'm going to be talking with, that I know would appeal to them or surprise them, whether it's new technology, whether it's the fact that 90% of new electricity installed around the world last year was clean energy, whether it's the fact that poor countries are actually empowering themselves through clean energy and they don't even have fossil fuel resources. Look for stories that intrigue, that surprise, that pique people's curiosity, that make people say, wow, that's fantastic. What great news.
That's great advice. I take that to heart because I have one of those families that I have to confront the issue, but do it cleverly. So here's another question. We don't want you to go. We want to stay another hour, but we probably have time just for 2 more questions. What community or activist actions have you seen that have the greatest and most positive effects on government policy?
Oh, so many examples. So we just hosted a book discussion last night by Andreas Carellis, who wrote a fantastic book called Climate Courage. And in Climate Courage, he has so many positive stories about the power of community. And I have seen many of those as well. So I have seen faith communities. I've seen school communities. I've seen cities and counties, and there's many great examples in Florida as well, where people have come together as a community. They have advocated for positive, constructive solutions. This is key. You don't just say there's a problem, you have to come up with a positive, constructive solution that people could be excited about and on board with. And then working with, rather than against, local decision makers and policymakers, respecting them, saying, I know that you want the best for people. I know that you're working within many constraints. I know there's many demands on your time and you've got many challenges. But have you considered this? Look at all the good things that would happen if you did this. Working with people, not dismissive, right? Mutual respect and finding points of agreement, and communities are incredibly powerful at doing that. So the book I mentioned was Climate Courage. It just came out recently, and it's a fantastic resource with many stories like that in it.
And have you seen personally elected officials responding to that sort of community pressure and making change? Like here in Florida, we are pushing municipalities and counties to make climate emergency declarations, formal declarations. But that's talk. And then in their declarations, we kind of go through, what are you planning to do and how quickly? So have you seen the corner being turned in your neck of the woods?
Well, I have. The city of Houston, which, as you know, is home to most of the large oil and gas companies in the US, they have just declared that they will have a net zero carbon goal. They'll be meeting their Paris Agreement and preparing for the risks of climate change. And they have had, I don't know how many citizens and community groups advocating for this for years and even decades. And Houston, one of the biggest cities in the US, just made that decision now. But I want to end with one more story, and it's this. So my TED Talk is called The Most Important Thing You Can Do is Talk About Climate Change. And it was released in December 2018. 5 months later, I was speaking in London, England at the London School of Economics. And after I spoke, I was walking out the door, a man came up to me, an older man, and he said, I took the train in to listen to your talk because I was so inspired by your TED Talk that I've been having conversations in the town where I live. It's a town of about 150, 200,000 people. And he said, in fact, I've been keeping a list of how many people have had climate conversations because of your TED Talk. Would you like to see it? I said, of course, I would love to see it. So he reached in his bag and I expected, he pulled out a list. I expected maybe 70 or 80 people, right? Because it's just been 4 or 5 months. He pulled out a list of 10,000 names. He said they had had 10,000 conversations in his town because of my TED Talk. And the city council had just voted to declare a climate emergency because of that.
Bravo.
Dr. Hayhoe, we cannot thank you enough. We need you all day long, 24/7. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your wonderful personality. You keep smiling in the midst of all of this crisis, and it gives me hope, gives us all hope.
Absolutely. I mean, Dr. Hayhoe, this was such a fantastic conversation. And the other day when we were talking about reminiscing, I told you I was going to show you a picture. And I wish I knew, I wish back then, 5 years ago, when we met at this particular climate summit, the COP21, where we actually have where the Paris Climate Accords were signed, I wish I knew all I know now about how to communicate about climate and how to communicate to different audiences. I remember I was so afraid of getting onto that podium to speak to the audience. And I saw you speak and I was just like in awe. So I just wanted to share that those 2 quick pictures just to get you back into memory lane. But this has been a fantastic conversation. I hope everybody has really learned a lot. And again, I thank you so much for everything you have shared with us today. It has been a wonderful conversation full of hope, full of techniques, full of great information that we can all use in our journey, in our climate education growth and journey. So now we're going to be asking you to help us with filling out some information. We're going to be asking you to fill out a 30-second poll. Remember, there will be 3 lucky winners who will win a great zero waste gift and also 25 gift card compliments of Earth Hero. And also, please don't remember that tomorrow we have a great program as well. We're gonna start the day with the director of the Atmosphere and Energy Program from Stanford University, Dr. Mark Jacobson, followed by a discussion to guide climate and health related policy. I wanna thank again our sponsors for their support and encourage you to visit our exhibitor center on the app to learn more about them. Remember, just to close, I wanted to highlight what we have discussed since yesterday, that this topic is not about left or right. And as Dr. Hayhoe has shown us, a thermometer isn't blue or red, liberal or conservative. It's not about polar bears. It's about us, people. And the care of the one thing that unites us all. And that thing that unites us all, it's our planet. It's our common home. So I hope all the information you have gotten today, the inspiration helps you to continue reframing those conversations and to continue speaking more about the climate crisis and mastering effectively how to communicate this complex topic. Now I leave you for today with the final movement class brought to you by the Sacred Space. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope to see you all again tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Just to remind everyone, tomorrow we look forward to seeing you again to see Dr. Mark Jacobson. We want to once again thank our sponsors for this amazing event. Thank you so much for everybody that joined us today. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.